September 1944. Picture this moment frozen in time, a history documentary scene that captures everything about the Second World War in a single image. Somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, beneath the grey canopy of autumn clouds, a Liberty ship cuts through the waves carrying human cargo that most histories overlook. In the dim hold of that vessel, surrounded by the smell of salt water and diesel fuel, 20-year-old Anna Müller huddles with dozens of other German women, staring through a porthole no larger than a dinner plate, at an ocean that seems to stretch into infinity. These women are prisoners of war, but not the soldiers you picture when you think of WWII stories. They're nurses, clerks, communication operators, members of the auxiliary services that kept the Wehrmacht functioning. And right now, crossing this ocean toward an unknown fate, every single one of them believes they're sailing toward their deaths. This is not the World War II narrative you learned in school. This is the untold story of how faith, not firepower, shattered the most effective propaganda machine in human history. Before we journey deeper into this remarkable military history, I want to ask you something. If you love discovering these hidden chapters of the Second World War, the human stories buried beneath the statistics and battle maps, take just a moment to subscribe to this channel. And down in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from, because these stories belong to all of us, no matter where we call home. Now, let's step back into that Liberty ship and understand how these women arrived at this moment of terror. The year 1944 marks a turning point in any World War II history documentary. By September, the war that Hitler promised would reshape Europe for 1,000 years was collapsing with stunning speed. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June had torn open the Western Front. Soviet armies were grinding westward through Poland, leaving scorched earth and shattered German divisions in their wake. In the skies above the Reich, American and British bombers flew in formation so vast they darkened the sun, reducing German cities to rubble night after night. For the German people, the propaganda broadcasts still proclaimed ultimate victory, but the evidence of defeat surrounded them in every direction. Food rations shrank to near starvation levels, refugees from the east clogged the roads, young boys and old men were drafted into the Volkssturm, a desperate last-ditch militia. And quietly, with little fanfare in the official press, German military personnel began surrendering in numbers that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Among those captured were women, a fact that surprises many people even today when they study this period of military history. The Nazi regime had mobilized German women extensively, though officially the ideology claimed a woman's place was in the home bearing children for the fatherland. Reality, as always, contradicted propaganda. Women served as Luftwaffe communications specialists, as Wehrmacht administrative staff, as nurses in field hospitals just behind the front lines, as Red Cross volunteers treating wounded soldiers. They wore uniforms. They followed military discipline, and when their units were overrun or surrounded, they became prisoners, just like their male counterparts. Anna Müller came from Bremen, a port city in northern Germany that had once thrived on international trade. Before the war, her father worked as a shipping clerk, her mother as a seamstress. Anna grew up in the 1930s, which meant she grew up under National Socialism. This context matters enormously for understanding this World War II documentary story. She joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, when she was 10 years old. She attended rallies where thousands of voices chanted in unison. She learned that Germany had been betrayed after World War I, that the Versailles Treaty was a humiliation, that the German people were destined for greatness if only they remained racially pure and politically loyal. She learned that Slavs were subhuman, that Jews were parasites, that communists wanted to destroy civilization, and that Americans were soft, materialistic, godless people incapable of matching German discipline and spirit. By the time she was 18 and training as a medical auxiliary, these ideas weren't just beliefs. They were the water she swam in, invisible because they were everywhere. When she was assigned to a field hospital unit in France in early 1944, she went willingly, proud to serve. When that unit was surrounded by advancing American forces in August, she expected the worst. Every piece of Nazi propaganda had prepared her for this moment. She had been told that American soldiers were barbaric, that they would rape German women, torture prisoners, parade captives through streets to be mocked and spat upon. She had been told that falling into enemy hands meant a fate worse than death. So when American GIs entered the hospital tent with weapons raised and began shouting orders in English, Anna's terror was absolute and genuine. The processing of prisoners was efficient and impersonal. German captives were searched, photographed, assigned identification numbers. Medical personnel examined them for injuries and diseases. Officers were separated from enlisted personnel. And then came the journey that would change everything. Transport trucks carried them to coastal ports, where they joined the vast machinery of the Allied prisoner of war system. By late 1944, the United States was holding hundreds of thousands of German POWs on American soil, in camps scattered across the country, from California to Virginia, from Texas to Wisconsin. This was a deliberate policy decision rooted in practical military history considerations. Keeping prisoners in Europe required resources, supplies, guards, all things needed for the continuing war effort. Shipping them to the United States meant they were completely removed from the fighting, unable to escape back to German lines, and could be put to work on farms and in factories to address America's wartime labor shortage. It also meant they got to see America firsthand, an experience that would prove more powerful than any number of propaganda leaflets or radio broadcasts. The Atlantic crossing took between 10 and 14 days, depending on the convoy's route and the U-boat threat. For the German women crowded into the holds of Liberty ships, those days were a descent into psychological hell. The ships were designed for cargo, not passengers. Bunks were narrow metal frames stacked 3 high. The air was stale and thick. The constant roll and pitch of the ocean made many violently seasick. And surrounding them were American guards armed watching, the supposed barbarians who would torture them once they reached land. Ganta refused food for the first 4 days. This detail appears in her diary, one of the few primary sources we have from German female POWs. She writes, "Better to starve than accept food from them. I told Lotta we should maintain our dignity even in captivity." But by the 5th day, hunger overpowered ideology. When an American sailor placed a tin tray in front of her with thick bread, buttered potatoes, and something she didn't recognize at first, her stomach betrayed her principles. She ate. And then she cried, not from shame exactly, but from confusion. The food was good. It was abundant. Nothing about this matched what she'd been told. The propaganda had said America was suffering too, that its people were starving just like Germans, that the Jewish conspiracy running Washington had bled the country dry. Yet here, on a military transport ship in the middle of a war, the food was richer than anything she'd eaten in Germany for years. This was the first crack in the ideological edifice, small but significant. Anna couldn't articulate it yet, couldn't process what it meant, but somewhere in her mind a question mark appeared where certainty had always lived. If they lied about the food, what else might be a lie? The ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia on a grey September morning. The women were ordered up on deck, lined up with their meager possessions, and marched down the gangway under the watch of military police. Anna braced herself for what came next. In her imagination, shaped by years of Nazi propaganda films and radio broadcasts, American cities would be filled with hostile crowds, people shouting and jeering, perhaps throwing things. The propaganda had shown her images of decadent Americans, race-mixed and morally corrupt, who would delight in humiliating their German captives. What she saw instead was a busy port, stevedores loading and unloading cargo, sailors hurrying about their duties, a few civilians walking past without giving the prisoners more than a curious glance. No mob, no public humiliation, just bureaucratic efficiency. They were loaded onto trucks and driven through the streets of Norfolk, and again Anna's worldview collided with reality. The city was intact. Buildings stood tall and undamaged. Shop windows displayed goods, actual goods, not empty shelves. Cars drove past, not military vehicles, but civilian automobiles with chrome and paint. Children walked to school wearing clean clothes, carrying lunchboxes. None of them looked starving. None of them looked defeated. Lotta whispered from beside her, "They told us America was collapsing. They told us Roosevelt had bankrupted the country. But look at this. Look at everything." Anna couldn't respond because she was thinking the same thing and didn't want to say it out loud. From Norfolk, they traveled by train deep into the American interior. For many of the German women, this train journey became the defining experience of their captivity, more impactful than anything that came before or after. The train rolled westward through Virginia, through the Appalachian foothills, across the great agricultural heartland of America. And for hours, pressed against the windows of the passenger cars, these women who had been raised on Nazi propaganda about American weakness stared in stunned silence at what passed before them. Fields of corn stretched to the horizon, vast geometric expanses of green and gold. Combines and tractors, huge mechanical beasts, moved across the land harvesting grain. Farmhouses stood freshly painted with full barns beside them. Small towns appeared every few miles, each with paved streets, churches with white steeples, stores with lighted signs. There were no bombed-out ruins, no refugees trudging along roads, no burned vehicles or destroyed bridges. Everything worked. Everything functioned. The infrastructure of American life hummed along without apparent strain. One woman, a former Luftwaffe communications specialist named Gerda, later wrote in a letter that survived the war, "We traveled for 2 days through American farmland and never once saw destruction or hunger. The children were fat. The shops were full. It was as if the war existed somewhere else entirely, not touching this place." This observation cuts to the heart of something crucial about World War II history that often gets overlooked in traditional military history documentaries. The war's impact was never symmetrical. While European cities burned and Asian nations bled, the continental United States remained physically untouched by combat. America's factories ran at full capacity producing weapons. Its farms grew surplus crops. Its civilian population experienced rationing but never starvation. The contrast between what these German women had left behind, a nation where every city showed scars of bombing, where food was desperately scarce, where the civilian population lived in constant fear, and what they now witnessed was so stark it couldn't be explained away by propaganda. Anna wrote in her diary that night, "I don't understand anymore. We were told they were suffering as much as us, but they're not. They're not suffering at all." The train finally reached its destination, a prisoner of war camp somewhere in the Midwest. The exact location varied. Dozens of such camps existed, but the layout was standard. Rows of wooden barracks arranged in neat grids, surrounded by double fences topped with barbed wire, watchtowers at regular intervals manned by guards with rifles. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter at night. Gates clanged shut with a finality that reminded everyone this was still captivity, still confinement behind wire. The German women were processed once again, photographed, issued uniforms that marked them as prisoners, assigned to barracks. Their fear returned in full force during this procedure. Whatever strangeness they'd witnessed during the journey, they were now locked inside an enemy camp with guards and guns and wire. Surely now the brutality would begin. Surely now they would learn what American captivity really meant. But again, reality refused to match expectation. They were given mattresses with clean sheets, the first many had slept on in months or years. They were issued boots that actually fit, clothing that was intact and not patched. Medical personnel examined them and treated minor ailments. The mess hall served hot food in portions that seemed impossibly generous, meat and vegetables and bread with butter. That first night in the barracks, lying on a mattress softer than anything she'd known during the war years, Anna felt something she later described as shameful relief. "I did not sleep on such a bed since before the war," she wrote. "I should feel terrible accepting comfort from the enemy. Instead, I just feel exhausted and grateful. What is happening to me?" What was happening was the systematic dismantling of a worldview through direct experience, and it was about to accelerate in ways none of these women could have predicted. The next morning came with the harsh mechanical rattle of a wake-up alarm, a sound that would become routine over the months ahead. Roll call, inspection, breakfast in the mess hall where American guards served food without comment or cruelty, just the mechanical efficiency of men doing a job. Work assignments were distributed. Some women were assigned to the camp laundry, others to kitchen duties, some to clerical work. The labor was not punitive, not designed to break them. just the ordinary maintenance tasks of a functioning camp. And then, after roll call, something happened that stopped every German woman in her tracks. One of the guards, a young man who spoke some German, pointed toward a small wooden building near the center of the compound. Above its doorway, plain and unmistakable, stood a wooden cross. The guard explained through a combination of broken German and gestures that would be clarified later through an interpreter that tomorrow was Sunday, and there would be church services and attendance was voluntary, and prisoners were welcome to attend if they wished. The women stared at the building in collective disbelief. A church, in a prisoner of war camp, available to enemy captives. Nothing in their Nazi indoctrination had prepared them for this possibility. The propaganda had told them Americans were materialistic pagans, obsessed with money and pleasure, spiritually empty. The Nazi ideology had claimed that Germany was the defender of Christian civilization against godless communism and Jewish Bolshevik atheism. Yet here, in captivity, behind barbed wire on enemy soil, stood a chapel with a cross, and they were being invited to worship. Gerda, always the skeptic, muttered what many were thinking: "This must be a trick. They will make us pray to humiliate us, or they will use it to identify the faithful so they can punish us." But Anna felt something different, a strange pull she couldn't name. "What if it's real?" she whispered back. "What if they actually mean it?" That night, the barracks buzzed with whispered debates. Some women insisted this was psychological warfare, a subtle form of torture designed to break their spirits by mocking their faith. Others argued it didn't make sense as a trick, because surely American guards had better things to do than stage elaborate fake church services. A few women, those whose faith had remained strong despite years of war, expressed cautious hope that they might actually be allowed to worship. The arguments went in circles until lights out, and even then Anna lay awake, staring at the wooden slats of the bunk above her, thinking about that cross. She had grown up Lutheran, attending services every Sunday with her family, until the war disrupted everything. The Nazi regime had a complicated relationship with Christianity, sometimes co-opting it for nationalist purposes, sometimes viewing it with suspicion as competition for German loyalty. But for ordinary Germans like Anna's family, faith had been a private anchor in the chaos of the age. Now, in the most unlikely place imaginable, she might have a chance to worship again. Sunday morning arrived with pale autumn sunlight filtering through the barracks windows. After breakfast, a small group of German women, perhaps 20 out of the hundreds in the camp, walked hesitantly toward the chapel building. Guards watched, but did nothing to stop them or hurry them along. The women moved as a cluster, drawing courage from each other's presence, ready to turn back at the first sign of mockery or danger. Anna was among them. She would later write that her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, that her hands were shaking. They pushed open the chapel door. Inside, the space was simple, almost austere. Wooden pews arranged in rows, a plain altar at the front with a white cloth, hymnals stacked neatly on a table by the door, windows letting in natural light, and at the front, waiting patiently, an American chaplain in military uniform. Captain William Harris, they would learn his name later, was a Methodist minister from Iowa, who had volunteered for the Army Chaplain Corps shortly after Pearl Harbor. He was in his mid-30s, with a kind face and calm demeanor that put people at ease even when they didn't speak his language. He nodded to the German women as they entered, smiled gently, and gestured for them to sit wherever they liked. An interpreter, a German-American soldier who served as translator, stood beside him. The service began with a hymn in English, something the German women didn't recognize. They sat stiffly, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the mockery or condemnation they still half expected. But it never came. The chaplain spoke briefly about grace and mercy, his words translated into German by the interpreter, and then he did something that would change everything. He looked directly at the German women and said, through the interpreter, "I know you are far from home, I know you are afraid and uncertain, but this is a house of God, and in God's house there are no enemies. You are welcome here." Then he announced the next hymn, and the number corresponded to something in the German hymnals that had been placed on the pews. Anna's hands trembled as she opened the book. The page showed Stille Nacht in German. Silent Night. Her breath caught. This was not some obscure hymn. This was the most famous Christmas carol in the world, originally written in German, in Austria, over a century earlier. And now, in an American prisoner of war camp in the middle of a war, an American chaplain was asking them to sing it. The music started and the American voices began in English. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. And then, quietly at first, Anna began to sing in German. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, alles schläft, einsam wacht. Other German voices joined hers, tentative and trembling. The two languages wove together, the same melody carrying different words, and in that moment, something cracked open in Anna's chest. She had sung this song every Christmas of her life. She had sung it with her family in their home in Bremen. She had sung it in the Hitler Youth before the complications set in. She had sung it in the field hospital in France, while wounded soldiers moaned in the background. And now she was singing it with Americans, her supposed enemies, and the harmony was perfect. Tears streamed down her face. Around her, other women were crying too, their voices breaking with emotion. For the first time since capture, Anna felt something other than fear or confusion. She felt home, or at least an echo of it, a reminder that something existed beyond nations and uniforms and ideology. When the hymn ended, the chapel was silent except for soft sobbing. Captain Harris waited patiently, letting the moment breathe, and then he spoke again through the interpreter. "You are welcome here," he repeated. "We pray not as enemies but as fellow children of God. Whatever happens in this war, whatever has happened before, in this place, you are our sisters in faith." The word struck like thunder. Sisters in faith. Not prisoners and guards, not Germans and Americans, not Nazis and allies. Sisters in faith. Anna couldn't process it. This violated everything she had been taught about warfare, about national loyalty, about us versus them. How could enemies pray together? How could the same God hear prayers from both sides of a conflict? The Nazi ideology had presented a clear moral universe where Germany was righteous and its enemies were evil. But here was an American chaplain claiming that God transcended those categories entirely. The women filed out of the chapel in stunned silence. Back in the barracks, the debate that erupted was fierce. Some insisted it was still a trick, a psychological operation designed to make them weak and compliant. "They want us to forget who we are," Gerda hissed. "They want us to betray the fatherland." But others, Anna among them, couldn't shake the memory of that hymn, the blending of German and English voices, the tears on the chaplain's face that suggested his emotion was as real as theirs. "I sang," Anna whispered to Lotta that night. "For a moment I forgot we were prisoners. I forgot we were enemies. I just sang and it felt like the only true thing in the world." Over the following days, the memory of the chapel haunted the camp. The German women talked about little else during mealtimes and work assignments. When the next Sunday arrived, twice as many attended. The chaplain greeted them again with the same gentle smile, and this time he invited them to choose a hymn in German. Hesitantly, one woman suggested Ave Maria, a Catholic hymn familiar to Germans of all denominations. To their amazement, the chaplain agreed immediately, and soon both German and English voices were rising together, weaving a tapestry of sound that made the wooden walls of the chapel seem to disappear. This was more destabilizing than the abundance of food or the clean mattresses. Those could be explained as pragmatic decisions by the Americans, keeping prisoners healthy to prevent disease or rebellion. But this sharing of sacred music, this acknowledgement of common faith, this couldn't be explained by propaganda. How could enemies who were supposed to be ruthless and barbaric sing the same hymns and pray to the same God? How could Americans, whom Anna had been taught were spiritually empty, demonstrate such reverence and compassion in worship? One woman wrote in a letter that surfaced decades later, "We were told America is without spirit, only machines and material wealth. But here in captivity, I found faith again. They prayed with us, not against us. This is the moment where we need to pause and understand the broader historical context of what was happening. This wasn't just about individual prisoners having personal epiphanies. This was a direct challenge to one of the most sophisticated propaganda systems ever created in military history. The Nazi regime had spent over a decade conditioning the German population to view the world through a racialized, nationalistic lens. Every institution, schools, churches, youth organizations, labor unions had been coordinated under the principle of Gleichschaltung, all pulling in the same ideological direction. Germans had been taught that they were biologically and culturally superior, that their enemies were subhuman or degenerate, that compromise or compassion toward the enemy was weakness or betrayal. This worldview was reinforced daily through newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, posters, speeches, rallies. It seeped into every aspect of life until it became invisible, the unquestioned baseline of reality. Breaking through that kind of indoctrination required more than just military defeat or logical arguments. It required direct experiences so powerful and undeniable that they couldn't be explained away. And that's exactly what was happening in these prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the American landscape. The role of military chaplains in this process deserves special attention in any serious World War II documentary. The US military had a long tradition of providing religious services to soldiers, viewing spiritual well-being as essential to morale and discipline. When the POW camps began filling up with German prisoners, the Chaplain Corps extended this ministry to include captives as well. This was not primarily about propaganda or psychological warfare, though it certainly had those effects. It was rooted in American religious culture and constitutional principles. The US military reflected a society where religious freedom was a foundational value, and that value extended even to enemy prisoners. The Geneva Convention, which governed treatment of POWs, required captive nations to allow prisoners to practice their religion, but the United States went further, actively facilitating worship through chaplains, translated hymnals, and dedicated chapel spaces. Captain Harris and chaplains like him genuinely believed they were doing God's work, ministering to souls in need, regardless of nationality. When Harris stood before German prisoners and told them they were welcomed as sisters in faith, he meant it literally. His theology didn't allow for enemies in God's house. This sincerity was palpable and impossible to fake, and the German women recognized it instinctively. They had spent years around Nazi officials whose ideology was performative and brutal. They knew the difference between genuine compassion and cynical manipulation. What they saw in the chapel was genuine. By late October 1944, the chapel services had become a regular feature of camp life. Sunday mornings saw the little wooden building filled to capacity with German women, joined sometimes by Italian POWs and a handful of Japanese prisoners from nearby compounds. What had begun as a cautious experiment had grown into something resembling a genuine community of worship across enemy lines, and it was working changes in the prisoners that would ripple forward for decades into the post-war world. For Anna Müller and women like her, the daily rhythm of captivity created space for reflection that had been impossible during the chaos of wartime Germany. In the camp, their basic needs were met. They were safe from bombing raids and artillery fire. They had time to think without constant propaganda blaring at them. The chapel became a focal point for this reflection, a place where questions could be asked that would have been dangerous to voice back home. If Americans were godless barbarians, why did they build chapels? If they were materialistic and spiritually empty, why did their chaplain weep when he prayed? If they were the enemy of Christian civilization, why did they invite German prisoners to worship freely? These questions couldn't be answered within the framework of Nazi ideology, which meant the framework itself was beginning to crack. Not all the German women experienced this transformation. Some clung stubbornly to their indoctrination, viewing the chapel services as a test of loyalty, a temptation to be resisted. Gerda remained defiant, refusing to attend after that second Sunday, insisting loudly that anyone who participated was a traitor. She and women like her represented the ideological hardliners who would carry Nazi beliefs into the post-war period, forming the kernel of those who refused to acknowledge guilt or complicity. But they were increasingly in the minority. Most of the women found themselves caught in cognitive dissonance so profound it was physically painful, and the only way to resolve it was to accept that much of what they'd been taught was false. As autumn deepened and November arrived, news from Europe grew darker from the German perspective. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat on the Eastern Front. Allied armies were pushing into Germany itself from the west. Cities like Cologne and Aachen were being fought over street by street. V-2 rockets launched at Britain provided propaganda victories, but couldn't change the strategic situation. Germany was losing, and everyone knew it, even if official broadcasts still spoke of wonder weapons and ultimate victory. For the prisoners in American camps, this news created a complicated emotional state. Relief that the war might soon end, mixed with dread about what that end would mean for their families and homeland. Guilt about living in relative safety and comfort, while their loved ones suffered bombing raids and starvation. And underneath it all, the growing realization that the cause they had served, the ideology they had believed in, was not just losing, but perhaps had been wrong from the beginning. The chapel became a place to process these emotions. Captain Harris, with pastoral wisdom, never gloated about German defeats or celebrated Allied victories during his sermons. Instead, he spoke about reconciliation, forgiveness, the possibility of rebuilding after destruction. His themes were carefully chosen to address the prisoners' psychological needs without explicitly mentioning the war. But everyone understood the subtext. If Germany lost, if Hitler's regime fell, what would rise from the ashes? What kind of nation could Germany become? And what role would these women play in that rebuilding? One Sunday in mid-November, Harris preached about the parable of the prodigal son, the story of a young man who squanders his inheritance but is welcomed home with love by his father. The sermon, translated carefully into German, spoke about mercy overcoming judgment, about the possibility of return and restoration even after terrible mistakes. Anna sat in the pew listening and realized with sudden clarity that Harris was talking about Germany itself, the prodigal nation that had wandered into darkness but might still find its way home. After the service, she lingered as other prisoners filed out. Through the interpreter, she asked Harris a question that had been building in her mind for weeks. How can you show us mercy? We are your enemies. Our country has done terrible things. How can you treat us like this? Harris looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful and sad. Then he said something Anna would remember for the rest of her life. Because mercy is not something you earn, it's something you need, and right now you need it, so we give it. The words settled over her like a benediction. That night in her diary she wrote, "I do not know what to believe anymore. Everything I was taught says this is weakness, that mercy is for the soft and defeated. But there is strength in this man's kindness, a strength I don't understand. He has defeated me more thoroughly than any weapon could." And she was right. What was happening in these camps was a form of ideological warfare far more effective than any propaganda leaflet or radio broadcast could ever be. The United States was demonstrating through direct action that its values of human dignity, religious freedom, and compassion were not just rhetoric, but lived reality. For prisoners who had been marinated in Nazi ideology that portrayed Americans as decadent and weak, this demonstration of strength through mercy was incomprehensible and therefore transformative. It's worth noting here, for any comprehensive World War II history documentary, that not all American POW camps were models of compassion. There were instances of poor conditions, harsh treatment, even abuse. The system was vast, with over 650 camps holding more than 400,000 German prisoners at the war's peak, and quality varied depending on camp commanders and guards. Some camps were run with brutal efficiency, focused purely on containment. But many camps, particularly as the war progressed and victory seemed assured, adopted more humane approaches. The chaplaincy program was widespread, and its effects were real. What makes Anna's story and stories like it significant is not that they represent universal experience, but that they represent a common enough experience to have mattered historically. Enough German prisoners returned home with positive views of American values that it influenced post-war reconstruction and the eventual alliance between the United States and West Germany. As winter approached and the camp prepared for colder weather, Captain Harris announced that Christmas services would be held, and something special was being planned. The German women whispered furiously about this in their barracks. Christmas in captivity, in enemy hands, celebrating the holiest night of the Christian year, while their families back home faced bombing raids and hunger. Some were outraged at the idea. Others were desperately curious. Anna found herself in the latter camp, drawn by the memory of those Sunday hymns and the peace she felt in the chapel. What she couldn't have known, what none of them could have predicted, was that Christmas 1944 would become the pivot point, the moment when faith and compassion would break through propaganda so completely that many of these women would never be the same. But that story, that transformation, was still ahead, building like a wave that would crest on Christmas Eve beneath the wooden rafters of a simple chapel in the American heartland. For now, as November turned to December and the first snow began to fall on the camp, the German women waited with a mixture of dread and hope for what the enemy's celebration of Christmas would bring. They had been captured expecting death. They had found abundance. They had expected godlessness. They had found faith. What would Christmas reveal? The answer would reshape their understanding of everything they thought they knew about this war, this enemy, and themselves. The first weeks of December 1944 brought a particular kind of cold to the American Midwest, the kind that settled into bones and made even the heated barracks feel drafty at night. Outside the camp, snow accumulated in white drifts against the barbed wire fences. Guards in the watchtowers stamped their feet and blew into their gloved hands. The war continued its grinding progress in Europe, American and British forces pushing toward the Rhine, while Soviet armies surrounded Budapest. But inside the POW camp, attention focused on something smaller and more intimate, the approaching Christmas holiday. For the German women prisoners, December was a month of emotional whiplash. Letters from home, heavily censored and often weeks old, brought devastating news. Cities reduced to rubble, family members killed in air raids, food so scarce that children were eating grass soup. One woman received word that her entire neighborhood in Hamburg had been destroyed by RAF bombing in July 1943, over a year earlier. But the news had only now reached her. She wept for days, mourning not just the loss, but the fact that she'd been living in ignorance while it happened. Anna received a brief note from her mother, carefully worded to pass the censors, saying that the family was managing as best we could and that they prayed Anna was alive and well. The note was dated October, which meant it had taken nearly 2 months to cross the Atlantic and navigate military postal systems. By the time Anna held it in her hands, anything could have changed. Her mother might have been killed in a December raid. Their home might have been destroyed. She had no way to know, and the uncertainty was a special kind of torture. Against this backdrop of grief and worry, the camp continued its preparations for Christmas. American guards strung lights along the main pathways, a sight that seemed almost obscene given the darkness consuming Europe. The mess hall decorated its walls with paper snowflakes and garlands, made from whatever materials were available, and the chapel received special attention. Pine branches were brought in from the surrounding countryside and arranged along the windowsills, filling the space with the sharp green scent of evergreen. Paper stars, carefully crafted by prisoners and guards alike, hung from the ceiling beams. Candles were placed in holders along the walls, ready to be lit on Christmas Eve. Captain Harris worked tirelessly, not just on the physical preparations, but on planning a service that would be meaningful for prisoners so far from home. He consulted with the German-speaking interpreter about which carols would be most familiar, which prayers might bring comfort rather than pain. He understood, with a pastor's intuition, that Christmas behind barbed wire could be either a balm or a wound, depending on how it was handled. What he was attempting was delicate, acknowledging the prisoners' grief and displacement, while offering them genuine celebration rather than mockery. The German women watched these preparations with a complex mixture of emotions. Gerda and her group of ideological holdouts viewed it as an insult, an attempt to make them forget their loyalty to the fatherland. "They're trying to buy us with decorations," she muttered. "Don't let them make you comfortable. Remember who you are, remember who they are." But others, Anna among them, felt pulled toward the chapel by something they couldn't fully articulate. The war had stolen so much, including the simple rhythms of civilian life like celebrating holidays with family. The prospect of marking Christmas, even in these strange circumstances, felt like reclaiming a piece of humanity that had been lost. On December 20th, Harris invited some of the German women to help with final preparations. This was a calculated risk on his part. Some camp administrators worried about fraternization between guards and prisoners, about creating relationships that might compromise security or discipline. But Harris believed that shared work in preparation for worship could itself be a form of ministry. A small group volunteered, including Anna and Lotte. They spent an afternoon in the chapel folding paper, arranging pine branches and practicing German carols with the chaplain's small choir of American soldiers who wanted to learn the melodies. It was surreal, Anna wrote later, to stand beside American GIs, the same men who had rifles slung over their shoulders during roll call, and teach them to pronounce German words like Weihnachten and Christkindl. They laughed at each other's pronunciation, made mistakes, started over. For those few hours, the categories of prisoner and guard seemed to dissolve into something more human. One young soldier from Wisconsin told Anna through the interpreter that his grandmother had been German, had immigrated before the First World War, and used to sing these same carols to him as a child. He had joined the army to fight Hitler, he said carefully, not to fight Germany or German people. The distinction seemed important to him, and Anna found herself nodding even though part of her wanted to resist the implication. Could you separate a nation from its government? Could you hate the regime while respecting the people? These were questions that Nazi ideology had never allowed because it had fused national identity with party loyalty so completely that questioning one meant questioning everything. As Christmas Eve approached, the tension in camp became almost unbearable. The German women prepared as best they could, washing their uniforms, braiding each other's hair, trying to create some sense of occasion. They had no gifts to exchange, no special clothes to wear, no way to mark the holiday except through attendance at the service. Some women announced they would boycott, considering it a betrayal to celebrate while Germany suffered. Others planned to attend but remain emotionally distant, observing the American spectacle without participating. And a few, Anna among them, decided simply to be open to whatever happened, to let the evening unfold without predetermined resistance or acceptance. The sun set early that December 24th, winter twilight painting the snow-covered camp in shades of blue and purple. After the evening meal, prisoners were given permission to move freely within the compound for several hours, an unusual relaxation of normal restrictions. The chapel glowed with warm light, its windows golden against the darkening sky. Smoke curled from its small chimney, where a wood stove had been lit to combat the cold. As 7 o'clock approached, the designated start time for the service, prisoners began walking toward the building in small groups, their breath visible in the freezing air. Anna walked with Lotte and a few others, their footsteps crunching on the packed snow. Her heart hammered in her chest with an intensity that surprised her. Why was she so nervous? It was just a church service, something she'd attended hundreds of times in her life. But this felt different, weighted with significance she couldn't name. When they pushed open the chapel door, the scene that greeted them stopped them in their tracks. The interior had been completely transformed. Every surface seemed to glow with candlelight, dozens of candles in holders along the walls, and windowsills creating a warm, flickering illumination. The pine garlands gave off their sharp scent. The paper stars hanging from the ceiling beams caught the light and seemed to dance. At the front of the chapel, beside the simple altar, stood a small evergreen tree decorated with more paper ornaments and strings of popcorn. And filling the pews, in a sight that made Anna's breath catch, were not just German prisoners, but American guards, camp administrators, medical staff, all mixed together without the usual rigid separation of captive and captor. Captain Harris stood at the front in his dress uniform, a smile on his face that was both solemn and joyful. Beside him, the interpreter waited, and behind them a choir of about 20 American soldiers stood ready to sing. As the German women filed in, finding seats wherever they could, Harris gestured for them to sit wherever they felt comfortable. There were no assigned sections, no segregation. Americans and Germans sat side by side in the pews, and the symbolism of this simple arrangement was not lost on anyone present. The service began at exactly 7 o'clock, with Harris offering a brief welcome in English, translated immediately into German. "Tonight we gather to celebrate the birth of Christ," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the wooden chapel. "On this holy night, we set aside the divisions of this world. We are not Americans and Germans, not guards and prisoners. We are children of God, gathered in worship. Whatever tomorrow brings, tonight we share this sacred moment in peace." The opening hymn was "O Come All Ye Faithful," sung first in English by the American voices. The familiar melody filled the space, and then Harris nodded to the German prisoners and invited them to join in their own language. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, German voices rose to meet the English ones. "Herbei, o ihr Gläubigen, fröhlich triumphierend," they sang, the Latin-rooted carol that transcended any single nation. The two languages wove together in harmony, neither dominating, both necessary to create the full sound. Anna felt tears prickling her eyes and refused to let them fall. Not yet. She had promised herself she would remain controlled, dignified. But the music was breaking through her defenses with every note. The service continued with readings from the Gospel of Luke, the nativity story read in both English and German. The interpreter's voice was steady as he translated the ancient words about Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem, about the inn with no room, about the baby born in a manger and announced to shepherds in the fields. Anna had heard this story every Christmas of her life, had heard it in church and at home and in school pageants, but tonight in this place it felt like she was hearing it for the first time. The story of displacement, of being far from home, of birth in the most unlikely circumstances, resonated with painful clarity. Weren't they all displaced? Weren't they all far from home? Wasn't new life emerging in the most unlikely of places? Then came the moment that would define the entire evening. Captain Harris stepped forward and announced through the interpreter that they would sing Stille Nacht, Silent Night together. He asked the German prisoners to lead, to begin the carol in their own language, and the Americans would join them in English, following the German tempo and phrasing. There was a long moment of silence. None of the German women wanted to be the first to sing, to take that vulnerable step of leadership in front of their captors. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the chapel, a single voice began. Anna never learned who started it, whether it was someone she knew or a stranger, but one German woman began to sing, and her voice trembled with emotion as the first words emerged. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. Others joined immediately, unable to resist the pull of that melody. Within seconds, every German voice in the chapel was singing, and the sound swelled to fill the space with heartbreaking beauty. Alles schläft, einsam wacht, nur das traute hochheilige Paar. The Americans waited, respectfully silent, letting the German verse complete. Then, as the second verse began, English voices joined in perfect time. Silent night, holy night, shepherds quake at the sight. The two languages blended, one melody carrying words in German and English simultaneously, and the harmony was so perfect, so complete, that it ceased to matter which language was which. German and American voices became indistinguishable in the shared hymn, united in this one perfect expression of faith and longing and hope. Anna lost her battle with tears. They streamed down her face as she sang, and she looked around the chapel through blurred vision and saw that she was not alone. Lotta was crying. Gerda, who had sworn she wouldn't attend, was in a back pew with tears running down her cheeks. American soldiers had wet eyes. Even Captain Harris, standing at the front leading the music, had tears on his face as he conducted. The chapel had become a space outside of time, outside of war, where the only reality that mattered was the shared recognition of common humanity and common faith. When the final verse ended, the silence that followed was profound. No one moved, no one spoke. The candles flickered, and the only sound was the occasional sniffle or intake of breath as people tried to compose themselves. Finally, Harris spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "I have been a chaplain for 3 years," he said through the interpreter. "I have held services in barracks and tents and open fields. I have prayed with men before battles and after losses. But I have never in all my ministry experienced anything like what just happened here. You have shown me that God's love is more powerful than any hatred, any war, any division we create. Thank you." The service continued with more carols, prayers, and a brief sermon about peace on earth and goodwill toward all people. But the emotional climax had already passed. Everything else felt like gentle denouement, necessary, but somehow less intense than that moment of shared singing. When the benediction was finally spoken and Harris dismissed the congregation, no one moved immediately. People sat in the pews, reluctant to leave, wanting to hold on to this feeling for as long as possible before stepping back out into the cold reality of the camp with its wire and guard towers. Eventually, slowly, prisoners and guards began to file out, but instead of separating immediately, they lingered in the chapel doorway and outside in the snow, talking quietly. The usual rigid boundaries had temporarily dissolved, and for these few minutes, Americans and Germans spoke to each other as human beings rather than enemies. One American guard, noticing Anna's tears, offered her his handkerchief. She accepted it with a whispered "Danke," and he nodded with understanding even though he probably didn't know the word. But the evening was not over. Harris had planned one more surprise, and as the crowd began dispersing toward the barracks, guards redirected the prisoners toward the mess hall instead. Confused but compliant, the German women followed, and when they entered the building, they gasped collectively. The long wooden tables that normally served food cafeteria style had been rearranged and covered with white sheets to resemble tablecloths. And on those tables sat a feast beyond anything they could have imagined. Roasted turkeys, golden and glistening, baked hams studded with cloves, bowls of mashed potatoes with butter melting on top, gravy in pitchers, cranberry sauce, stuffing, fresh bread rolls, butter, apple pies and pumpkin pies cooling on side tables, coffee, real coffee, steaming in large urns. The abundance was staggering, offensive almost in its excess, given what they knew their families were enduring back in Germany. Red Cross parcels had been opened and arranged along the tables, each containing luxuries that had become mythical in wartime Germany. Chocolate bars, tins of coffee, packages of cigarettes, soap, condensed milk. The American camp staff had clearly gone to extraordinary lengths to create this Christmas meal, using rationed supplies and donated goods to put together something special. The German women stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what they were seeing. Gerda was the first to speak, her voice sharp with anger and grief. "How can it be that we prisoners eat like this, while our families at home starve? What kind of cruel joke is this?" Her words captured what many were feeling, the painful cognitive dissonance of being treated well while their loved ones suffered. One of the American guards, an older man who spoke some German, approached the group. His voice was gentle as he responded, "This meal is not to mock you, it is Christmas. Tonight we are not enemies, only people. Please sit and eat." The invitation hung in the air, and slowly, reluctantly, the prisoners began to move toward the tables. They sat down on the wooden benches, staring at the food in front of them. American staff and guards joined them, sitting interspersed with the prisoners rather than at separate tables. Harris said a blessing over the meal, thanking God for the food and for the temporary peace of this evening, and then everyone began to eat. Anna took a bite of turkey, and the flavor exploded in her mouth, rich and savory in a way she'd almost forgotten food could be. She'd been eating adequately in the camp, certainly better than in Germany during the final war years. But this was something different entirely. This was abundance for its own sake, food prepared with care and served with generosity. As she ate, guilt warred with gratitude in her chest. Every bite felt like a betrayal of her family, her nation. Yet she was so hungry, and the food was so good, and she couldn't make herself stop. Around the table, similar conflicts played out. Some women ate with relish, having made peace with their situation. Others picked at their food, taking small bites almost furtively. A few refused to eat anything, sitting in silent protest, though their eyes betrayed their hunger. Conversation began slowly, carefully. An American soldier asked through the interpreter where Anna was from, and she told him about Bremen, about its port and its history. He told her he was from Baltimore, also a port city, and they found common ground in that shared urban maritime experience. The conversation was superficial, almost absurdly so given the circumstances, but it was human connection, and that mattered more than the words themselves. As the meal progressed and the initial shock wore off, something remarkable happened. Laughter began to emerge, tentative at first, but growing more confident. Someone made a joke about the size of the turkeys, and it got translated, and both Germans and Americans chuckled. An American soldier tried to pronounce a German word, and mangled it so badly that the Germans laughed, not in mockery, but in genuine amusement, and corrected his pronunciation. Small moments of levity broke through the heavy emotional weight of the evening, reminding everyone that joy could still exist even in the darkest times. Captain Harris moved from table to table, checking on everyone, ensuring the prisoners felt welcome rather than pressured. When he reached Anna, he paused and asked through the interpreter how she was doing. Anna looked up at him, this American chaplain who had engineered this entire evening, and tried to find words for what she was feeling. "I don't understand," she finally said. "We are your enemies. Our countries are at war. My nation has done terrible things. I know this now. Why are you being kind to us?" Harris considered the question seriously before responding. "Because kindness is not conditional on whether someone deserves it. It's who we choose to be regardless of circumstances. And because I genuinely believe that you are not our enemy. Hitler is our enemy. The Nazi regime is our enemy. But you are just a young woman far from home on Christmas, and that deserves compassion." His answer was so simple, so direct, that Anna had no response. She simply nodded and returned to her meal, but his words echoed in her mind for the rest of the night and indeed for the rest of her life. The Christmas feast lasted for hours, with people eating slowly and savoring both the food and the temporary suspension of normal camp protocols. When it finally ended, and the prisoners were dismissed to their barracks, they walked through the snow in small groups, talking quietly about what they'd experienced. Back in Barrack 7, where Anna and Lotta slept, the usual lights-out routine was delayed as women sat on their bunks and processed the evening. Some were angry, viewing the kindness as manipulation. "They're trying to make us forget," one woman insisted. "They want us to feel grateful to our captors so we'll be compliant." But most were simply confused, caught between conflicting emotions. Anna sat on her bunk with her diary, writing by the dim light of the single bulb that stayed on all night. Her entry for December 24th, 1944, captured the turmoil. "We were prepared to be hated. We were prepared for punishment and cruelty. Instead, they shared their holy night with us. The enemy sang our carols, broke bread with us, and treated us as if we were their own. I ate until I was full for the first time in years. I sang in German and was not silenced. An American chaplain told me I was a child of God, equal to any other. I do not know what to believe anymore. Everything I was taught says this is weakness, that mercy is softness, that our enemies are monsters. But tonight I saw only human beings, and they showed me more compassion than my own government ever did. I am so confused. I am so grateful. I am so ashamed of being grateful. God forgive me. I don't know what I am anymore." She closed the diary and lay back on her mattress, staring at the wooden ceiling, and for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to think a thought that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. What if everything she'd been taught was a lie? The Christmas service became a turning point, not just for Anna, but for many of the German women in that camp and in similar camps across the United States. In the days and weeks that followed, attendance at Sunday services grew dramatically. Women who had refused to set foot in the chapel, who had viewed it as enemy territory or a trap, began to reconsider. The power of that shared Christmas hymn, the memory of German and American voices united in silent night, proved impossible to ignore or explain away through ideological frameworks. If the enemy could share your most sacred holiday with genuine respect and warmth, if they could sing your songs and pray your prayers and treat you not as a despised captive but as a sister in faith, then they weren't really the enemy, were they? And if they weren't the enemy in the way you'd been taught, then what else might be false? What else might need re-examining? Captain Harris, with pastoral wisdom, understood that something significant had happened. In his sermons during January 1945, he began to explicitly address themes of forgiveness and reconciliation, not in abstract theological terms, but in concrete ways that applied to the prisoner's situation. He spoke about letting go of hatred, about the possibility of building a new life after destruction, about faith as something that transcended national loyalties. His messages were carefully crafted to avoid anything that could be construed as coercion or propaganda. He never asked the German prisoners to renounce their country or condemn their government. He simply invited them to consider that God's love was larger than any human conflict, and that they were included in that love, regardless of their nationality or past actions. For many prisoners, these sermons hit with devastating force. Lotta confided to Anna one night, "If these Americans can sing our songs and feed us on Christmas, how can they be the monsters we were told they are? And if they're not monsters, then what have we been fighting for?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and necessary. What had they been fighting for? The Nazi regime had told them they fought for German survival, for Lebensraum, for protection against Jewish Bolshevik conspiracies, for racial purity and national greatness. But none of that explained why American captors would treat them with such dignity and compassion. The ideological framework didn't account for this data. And when a worldview can't explain direct lived experience, the worldview begins to crack. By the end of January 1945, those cracks were widening into fissures. News from Europe grew progressively worse from the German perspective. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major counterattack in the West, had failed with massive casualties. Soviet forces were driving into Germany itself, with horrifying reports of atrocities against German civilians. Allied bombers continued to reduce German cities to rubble. The war was clearly lost. Anyone with eyes could see it. But the Nazi regime refused to surrender, instead demanding that Germans fight to the last man, woman, and child. For the prisoners in American camps, this created a strange emotional state. Relief that they were safe from the fighting, mixed with survivors' guilt about their families still in danger. Horror at what was happening to Germany mixed with growing recognition that perhaps the Nazi regime deserved to fall. And underneath everything, the persistent question, what comes next? If Germany loses, if Hitler's 1,000-year Reich collapses after just 12 years, what will rise from the ruins? What kind of nation could Germany become? And what role would they play in that rebuilding? The chapel became a place to wrestle with these questions, not through explicit political discussion, which would have been inappropriate and probably forbidden, but through the language of faith and morality. When Harris preached about redemption, prisoners heard messages about national redemption. When he spoke about repentance and renewal, they heard possibilities for German renewal. When he emphasized that God's love was unconditional, they began to imagine that perhaps Germany could be forgiven and welcomed back into the community of nations, not through military might, but through genuine transformation. This was psychological and spiritual warfare at its most effective, though it's important to note that American authorities probably didn't consciously design it that way. The chapel program existed primarily for legitimate religious and humanitarian reasons, to meet the spiritual needs of prisoners as required by the Geneva Convention and American values. But its effects were undeniably political, creating a cohort of German prisoners who would return home with fundamentally altered worldviews, having seen that democracy and Christianity were not incompatible, as Nazi ideology claimed, that American values were not empty rhetoric, but lived realities, and that former enemies could be reconciled through genuine compassion rather than forced submission. As winter gave way to early spring in 1945, the war entered its final phase. By March, Allied armies had crossed the Rhine River and were advancing into Germany's industrial heartland. In the east, Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin. The Nazi regime was disintegrating, with local commanders surrendering rather than following Hitler's orders to fight to the death. The propaganda machine still churned out messages about final victory and wonder weapons, but increasingly no one believed it. In the camps, German prisoners followed the news with a mixture of dread and numbness, knowing that the end was coming, but unable to fully process what that end would mean. Easter Sunday, 1945, fell on April 1st, the first day of April, and the symbolism of new life and resurrection carried particular weight that year as Europe's deadliest war stumbled toward its conclusion. In the POW camp where Anna Müller and her fellow prisoners lived behind barbed wire, preparations for Easter began in late March with an intensity that surprised many of the German women. Captain Harris had been planning for months, understanding that Easter, following so closely on the heels of their transformative Christmas experience, could serve as another milestone in the prisoners' spiritual and psychological journey. But this Easter would be different in a crucial way. Christmas had been about comfort and shared humanity in the darkness of winter. Easter would be about resurrection and hope, about the possibility of life emerging from death, and given the state of Germany and the impending collapse of the Nazi regime, those themes carried almost unbearable relevance. The camp itself was awakening from winter. Snow had melted, leaving mud everywhere, but also revealing the first green shoots of spring grass. The days were growing longer, warmer. Birds returned to the surrounding countryside, filling the air with song. The contrast between this renewal in nature and the destruction consuming Germany created a powerful sense of dissonance. Anna wrote in her diary, "Everything here is coming to life while everything there is dying. I should be there, suffering with my people, but instead I'm here watching spring arrive in safety. The guilt is crushing sometimes." In the weeks leading up to Easter, rumors circulated through the barracks that Captain Harris was planning something special for the service. The German women whispered about it during work assignments, during meals, during the long evenings in the barracks. Gerda, who had been deeply affected by Christmas despite her earlier resistance, muttered that they would probably use Easter to mock German defeat, to celebrate Allied victory at German expense. But Anna shook her head. Christmas was no trick, she insisted. It was real. Whatever they're planning for Easter, I think it will be real too. On Palm Sunday, 1 week before Easter, Harris invited several German prisoners to help prepare the chapel for the holiday. Anna volunteered immediately, and to her surprise, so did Gerda. They spent an afternoon in the chapel with American soldiers and other prisoners, cleaning, arranging flowers that had been sourced from somewhere despite wartime restrictions, practicing hymns. Harris had obtained white lilies, the traditional Easter flower, though where he found them in rural wartime America, Anna never learned. The scent of the lilies filled the chapel, sweet and almost overwhelming, a smell Anna associated with every Easter of her childhood. As they worked, Harris explained through the interpreter what he envisioned for the Easter service. He wanted it to be truly collaborative, with German prisoners not just attending, but actively participating. He asked if some of the women would be willing to prepare a hymn in German to sing during the service, and he asked if anyone would be comfortable reading scripture in German during the liturgy. The request was bold, essentially inviting the prisoners to lead portions of their own worship, and it signaled a level of trust and respect that still surprised Anna even after months of similar treatment. Anna and 2 other women agreed to prepare Christ ist erstanden, a traditional German Easter hymn. They practiced in the chapel over the next few days, their voices growing more confident as they rehearsed. The hymn's lyrics spoke of Christ's resurrection conquering death, and the metaphorical resonance was impossible to ignore. What deaths needed conquering in their own lives? What resurrections might be possible? On the evening before Easter, Anna lay awake in her bunk, thinking about the service the next morning. She had attended Easter services her entire life, but this one felt different, weighted with significance that went beyond religious observance. Germany was dying. Everyone knew it. The question was what would be born from that death. Could a new Germany rise, cleansed of Nazi ideology, or would there be only rubble and grief? The answer seemed impossibly distant, but the Easter liturgy suggested that resurrection was always possible, even from the most complete destruction. She finally fell asleep near midnight, her mind full of images of lilies and crosses and empty tombs. Easter morning dawned clear and bright, with a cloudless sky that seemed impossibly blue after the grey of winter. After breakfast, The prisoners were given an hour to prepare themselves, to wash and dress as formally as their limited wardrobes allowed. At 9 o'clock, the chapel bell rang, calling everyone to worship. Anna joined the stream of prisoners walking toward the wooden building, and she noticed that the crowd was larger than usual. Women who never attended services were coming, drawn by curiosity or by the need for meaning on this particular day. When they entered the chapel, the transformation from Christmas was immediately apparent. Where Christmas had been about warm candlelight and evergreen darkness, Easter was about white and light. The lilies lined the altar, their white petals glowing in the morning sun that streamed through the windows. White cloths covered every surface. The wooden cross at the front of the chapel had been draped with white fabric, symbolizing Christ's burial shroud and his victory over death. And the windows themselves had been cleaned until they sparkled, letting in floods of natural light that made the entire space feel larger and more open than before. The chapel was packed, every pew filled, with prisoners standing along the back wall. Anna found a seat near the middle with Lotta beside her. She looked around and saw Germans, Italians, a few Japanese prisoners from a nearby compound, and American guards and staff, all packed together in this small wooden building for a shared celebration of resurrection. The service began with an opening hymn, "Christ the Lord is risen today," sung first in English by the American choir. The melody was triumphant, almost martial in its confidence, and the voices filled the chapel with joyful sound. Then Harris nodded to Anna and the other German women who had prepared their hymn. They stood nervously and began to sing, "Christ ist erstanden," their voices trembling at first but growing stronger. "Christ ist erstanden von der Marter alle, des sollen wir alle froh sein, Christ will unser Trost sein." The German words rose to meet the English ones in a harmony that was not planned, but emerged naturally from the two languages addressing the same reality. The Americans began to sing their hymn again, and for several verses the two songs wove together, German and English proclaiming the same resurrection in different words and melodies that somehow fit together perfectly. Anna felt tears starting again, as they had at Christmas, but these were different. Christmas tears had been about longing and displacement and unexpected compassion. Easter tears were about hope, about the possibility that destruction was not final, that new life could emerge even from total defeat. She looked around the chapel through blurred vision and saw that she was not alone. Gerda was weeping. Lotta was weeping. American soldiers had tears on their faces. Even Captain Harris, conducting the music with his hands, had wet cheeks. The chapel had become a space where grief and hope intermingled, where the resurrection story spoke to everyone's deepest needs regardless of nationality. After the hymns came scripture readings, the Easter texts from the Gospels about women finding the empty tomb, about Jesus appearing to his disciples, about the impossible news that death had been defeated. These texts were read in both English and German, with Harris reading in English and a German prisoner reading the translated verses. The bilingual liturgy created a kind of antiphonal effect, each language echoing and reinforcing the other, emphasizing that this story belonged to all Christians regardless of which side of the war they fought on. Then Harris preached, his sermon simple and direct. He spoke about resurrection not just as historical event, but as ongoing possibility. He spoke about how death and defeat, whether literal or metaphorical, were never the end of the story for those who had faith. He spoke about the possibility of new beginnings after total destruction. And while he never mentioned Germany explicitly, never made overt political statements, everyone in that chapel understood the subtext. Germany was experiencing a kind of death, the collapse of everything the Nazi regime had built. But death was not final. Resurrection was possible. New life could emerge from the ruins, not through denial or defiance, but through genuine transformation. Through the interpreter, Harris's words reached the German prisoners with particular force. "Many of you," he said, "are facing losses you cannot yet fully understand. You have lost homes, perhaps lost family members, certainly lost the nation you thought you knew. That grief is real and valid. But I want you to hear this clearly. Loss is not the same as ending. Death is not the final word. Resurrection means that God can take even the most complete destruction and bring forth new life. You are not defined by what has been lost. You are defined by what can still be born in you and through you. The words settled over the prisoners like a benediction. Anna felt something shift in her chest, a release of tension she hadn't known she was carrying. For months she had been wrestling with guilt over surviving while others died, over eating while her family starved, over finding comfort in captivity. But Harris's words suggested that her survival might have purpose, that she might have a role to play in whatever came next, that Germany's resurrection might require people like her who had seen that another way of living was possible. After the sermon came another shock, though one that Harris had carefully prepared for. He introduced a special guest, a chaplain from a nearby army unit, who would offer a brief message. The guest chaplain walked to the front of the chapel, and the German women's reaction was immediate and visceral. He was black, an African-American army chaplain in full uniform, and the sight of him standing at the pulpit with authority made many of the German prisoners stiffen in their seats. Nazi racial ideology, drilled into them from childhood, had taught that black people were racially inferior, uncivilized, incapable of intellectual or spiritual leadership. Yet here stood a man who contradicted everything they'd been taught, an educated, articulate officer, speaking from a position of respect and authority. The chaplain's name was Captain James Washington, and he had volunteered to participate in the Easter service specifically to challenge the German prisoners' racial prejudices. He understood, as did Harris, that defeating Nazi ideology required more than just demonstrating American compassion. It required directly confronting the racism at the heart of that ideology. Washington began to speak, his voice deep and resonant, and the interpreter translated his words into German. "I stand before you today," he said, "as a minister of the gospel and as an officer in the United States Army. I know that my presence here may challenge some of your assumptions. I know that you have been taught things about people who look like me, things that are not true. But I am not here to condemn you for what you were taught. I am here to invite you to see with your own eyes and hear with your own ears and judge for yourselves what is true." He spoke about his own journey of faith, about growing up in a segregated South where he faced discrimination and hatred, about how the Christian gospel of universal human dignity had given him strength to resist bitterness. He spoke about serving as a chaplain and ministering to soldiers of all races, about discovering that when people pray together, artificial divisions dissolve. And then he said something that would echo in Anna's memory for decades. "When we pray, we do not ask God about the color of those who kneel beside us. We ask only that He hears us. In God's house, there is no superior or inferior race. There are only children, all equally loved, all equally precious." The silence after his words was heavy and profound. The German women sat frozen, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Here was a man who, according to Nazi racial theory, should have been ignorant and servile, speaking with eloquence and dignity about faith and justice. Here was a man whom they'd been taught to view as subhuman, demonstrating more humanity and compassion than most of the Nazi officials they'd ever encountered. Some of the prisoners refused to meet his gaze, staring at their laps or at the floor, unwilling to confront the cognitive dissonance he represented. But others, Anna among them, looked directly at him and felt their worldview shifting again. She could not deny the dignity with which he carried himself. She could not dismiss the respect with which the American soldiers in the chapel listened to him, not the forced respect of fear, but the genuine respect earned through character. She could not explain away his education, his eloquence, his clear moral authority. If he was everything Nazi ideology said a black person couldn't be, then Nazi ideology was simply wrong, and if it was wrong about this, what else was it wrong about? After Washington finished speaking, Harris invited him to stand beside the altar as an equal partner in ministry, and together they led the congregation in a final hymn. The sight of the two chaplains, one white and one black, standing side by side in front of German prisoners and American soldiers, conducting worship together, was a visual sermon more powerful than any words. It demonstrated in concrete terms what Christian universalism actually looked like, how faith could transcend not just national boundaries, but racial ones as well. The service concluded with a benediction spoken in both English and German, Harris and Washington alternating lines, their voices blending in a final prayer for peace and renewal. As people filed out of the chapel into the bright April morning, the atmosphere was subdued, almost stunned. The experience had been too intense, too challenging to be easily digested. The German women walked back to their barracks in small groups, talking quietly. Some were angry, viewing Washington's presence as a provocation, an attempt to humiliate them by forcing them to accept a black man as their spiritual superior. Gerda muttered, "They want to break us completely, to make us renounce everything we believe." But Anna shook her head. "What if," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "what if that's not what this is about? What if they're not trying to break us? What if they're trying to show us truth?" Gerda stared at her. "You're defending them now. You're accepting their propaganda." "Is it propaganda if it's real?" Anna replied. "That chaplain, Washington, he was real. His education was real. His dignity was real. We were taught that people like him were inferior, but he's not. He's just not. And if we were lied to about that, what else were we lied to about?" The question hung in the air as they reached their barracks. It was a question that many of the German women were asking themselves in the weeks that followed Easter 1945, as news from Europe grew increasingly dire and the final collapse of Nazi Germany became imminent. They had arrived in America expecting barbarism and had found compassion. They had expected godlessness and found faith. They had expected racial superiority to be obvious and instead had encountered individuals who shattered all their stereotypes. The accumulated weight of these experiences was crushing the ideological foundation they'd been raised upon. And while some resisted desperately, clinging to the familiar certainties of Nazi propaganda, many others found themselves standing on uncertain ground, forced to rebuild their understanding of the world from scratch. The weeks following Easter were filled with restless conversations in the barracks. The German women processed what they'd seen, what they'd heard, what it all meant. Some insisted that Captain Washington had been an exception, a specially selected individual meant to deceive them, and that the Nazi teachings about racial hierarchy remained generally true. But others pointed out that Washington had mentioned other black soldiers, black officers, black professionals. If he was just an exception, why were there so many exceptions? Why did the American military integrate black chaplains into positions of authority? Why did white American soldiers listen to him with genuine respect rather than forced compliance? The questions multiplied and the old answers stopped working. Lotta confided to Anna one evening, "I keep thinking about my teachers in school, the ones who taught us racial science, who showed us charts and diagrams proving German superiority. They were so confident, so certain. But they were wrong, completely wrong. And if they were wrong about something so fundamental, how can I trust anything else they taught us?" It was a devastating realization, the collapse of epistemic authority. If your teachers lied, if your government lied, if your entire educational system was built on falsehoods, then how do you know what's true? The only answer was direct experience, evidence gathered with your own eyes and ears, and that evidence increasingly contradicted everything the Nazi regime had taught. Meanwhile, the war ground toward its conclusion. By mid-April, news reached the camp that Soviet forces had encircled Berlin. American and British armies were driving deep into Germany, encountering concentration camps and discovering the full extent of Nazi atrocities. The reports that filtered into the POW camp were fragmentary and disturbing. Stories of mass murder on an industrial scale, of gas chambers and crematoriums, of millions of Jews and others systematically exterminated. Many German prisoners initially refused to believe these reports, dismissing them as Allied propaganda, designed to justify the war and demonize Germany. "It's lies," Gerda insisted. "They're making up stories to make us look evil so they can feel good about destroying our country." But the reports kept coming from multiple sources, with photographic evidence, with testimony from American soldiers who had liberated the camps and seen the horrors firsthand. And slowly, reluctantly, some of the prisoners began to accept that perhaps these atrocities were real, that the regime they had served, however peripherally, had committed crimes beyond comprehension. Anna struggled with this more than anything else. She had known vaguely that Jews were being persecuted, that they'd been stripped of rights and forced to wear yellow stars and sent to labor camps. Everyone in Germany knew that much, though most chose not to think about it too deeply. But systematic extermination, murder on the scale of millions, the sheer enormity of it seemed impossible to grasp. Yet the evidence kept accumulating, and at a certain point, denial became its own form of moral failure. She wrote in her diary during this period, "If even half of what we're hearing is true, then we are all guilty. Not just the leaders, not just the SS, but all of us who looked away, who didn't ask questions, who accepted what we were told without demanding proof. I was young, I thought I was just a nurse helping wounded soldiers, but I was part of a system that did these things. How do I live with that? How does any of us live with that?" Captain Harris, with his pastoral sensitivity, understood that the prisoners were processing devastating revelations. In his sermons during late April, he began to address themes of guilt, repentance, and moral responsibility in ways that were clearly meant to help the German prisoners navigate this psychological and spiritual crisis. He never directly accused them of personal complicity in Nazi crimes that would have been both pastorally inappropriate and legally problematic. But he spoke about collective responsibility, about the difference between guilt and shame, about the possibility of genuine repentance and transformation. Guilt, he preached one Sunday, is about what you have done. Shame is about who you are. Guilt can be addressed through confession, repentance, and amendment of life. Shame is more insidious because it attacks your identity, making you believe you are irredeemable. I want to be clear with all of you listening today. Whatever has happened, whatever your nation has done, whatever role you may have played, even unknowingly in terrible events, you are not beyond redemption. God's mercy is larger than any human sin, but redemption requires honesty. It requires looking directly at the truth, however painful, and acknowledging it. You cannot heal what you refuse to see. The words landed hard. Some prisoners walked out of the service, unable or unwilling to hear the implications. Others sat in stony silence, rejecting the premise that they bore any responsibility for crimes committed by others. But many, Anna among them, heard in Harris's words a lifeline, a way forward through the moral catastrophe of Germany's collapse. If redemption was possible, if transformation was real, then perhaps there was hope not just for individuals, but for the nation itself. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin. The news reached the camp within days, though the official German announcement was delayed. The prisoners' reactions varied wildly. Some wept at the death of the Führer, still loyal despite everything. Others felt nothing, their emotional reserves exhausted. A few experienced something like relief, a sense that with Hitler's death, the spell was finally broken. The mad dream of the 1,000-year Reich definitively over. Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, and that evening the camp fell into an eerie silence. Victory in Europe, celebrated raucously by the American guards and staff, meant defeat and humiliation for the German prisoners. They gathered in their barracks, processing the reality that their nation had been utterly defeated, occupied by foreign armies, its cities in ruins, its people displaced and starving. Everything they had been promised, everything they had sacrificed for, had come to nothing. Anna sat on her bunk that night, unable to cry despite the enormity of the moment. She felt hollowed out, emptied of emotion. Germany was defeated. The Reich had fallen, and she was alive, safe, well-fed, in an enemy camp thousands of miles from home, while her family endured the consequences of that defeat. The guilt was almost unbearable. That Sunday, May 13th, Captain Harris addressed the prisoners directly for the first time about Germany's defeat. His words were carefully chosen, neither gloating nor dismissive of the prisoners' grief. "Your war is over," he said gently through the interpreter. "I know this brings you no joy. I know you are thinking of your families, your homes, your nation. I know you are afraid of what comes next. But I want to say something important. Your war is over, but your lives are not. You are more than citizens of a defeated country. You are human beings with inherent dignity and worth. Faith remains, compassion remains, hope remains, and you remain, each of you a person capable of building something better from these ruins." He paused, letting the words sink in, then continued. "I have served as chaplain in this camp for over a year. I have watched many of you transform, watched you question what you were taught, and open yourselves to new understanding. That transformation is more important than you realize. Germany will need people like you in the years ahead, people who have seen that another way of living is possible, people who understand that democracy and faith are not incompatible, people who can help rebuild not just buildings, but the moral foundation of your nation. That is your calling now if you choose to accept it." The sermon was more explicitly political than anything Harris had preached before, but in the context of Germany's total defeat, spiritual and political concerns had become inseparable. What kind of nation would Germany become? That question would be answered by Germans themselves, and the prisoners sitting in American POW camps would play a role in that answer, carrying home not just memories of captivity, but fundamentally altered worldviews. Over the following weeks, as spring turned to summer, the reality of defeat settled in. The prisoners received more letters from home, many delayed by months, bringing news of the occupation, the food crisis, the displaced persons flooding the roads. The destruction was total, beyond anything they had imagined even during their most pessimistic moments. Anna finally received word that her family had survived, her mother and younger brother living in the rubble of their bombed apartment building, subsisting on rations that were barely enough to sustain life. The relief of knowing they were alive was tempered by the knowledge of what they were enduring while she lived in relative comfort. The camp settled into a new routine, no longer technically at war, but not yet preparing for repatriation. The German prisoners worked, attended chapel services, received occasional Red Cross parcels, and waited for news about when they would be allowed to return home. The American authorities were in no hurry to repatriate prisoners, while Germany was still chaotic and food scarce. Better to keep them in America, where they could be fed and housed, at least until basic order was restored in occupied Germany. This extended captivity gave the chapel ministry time to deepen its impact. By summer 1945, most of the German women in the camp attended services regularly. The chapel had become the center of their community life, a place where they could process their grief and confusion in the language of faith. Captain Harris continued his patient ministry, preaching about reconciliation, about building a new life after loss, about the difference between patriotism and nationalism. He never demanded that the prisoners renounce their German identity, but he consistently invited them to imagine a Germany transformed, purged of hatred and racism, integrated into the international community through shared values rather than military might. In June, Harris organized a special service focused on prayer for Germany's recovery. It was a bold choice that could have backfired, seeming either mocking or naive, but Harris's genuine compassion made it work. He invited the German prisoners to offer prayers in their own language for their families, their cities, their nation. Americans and Germans prayed together for healing, for food, for shelter, for wisdom for the occupying authorities. The sight of American soldiers bowing their heads while German prisoners prayed in German for Germany's welfare was extraordinary, a demonstration of the Christian ideal of loving your enemies that most people never witness in concrete terms. Anna prayed that day for her mother and brother, for Bremen, for all the German children who were growing up amid ruins, and she prayed for herself, for the strength to carry what she had learned back home, to be part of Germany's resurrection rather than its continued suffering. By July, preparations for repatriation finally began. Groups of prisoners were assembled, given medical checkups, issued travel papers. The camp buzzed with nervous energy as women prepared to return to families they hadn't seen in over a year, to a homeland they barely recognized from the descriptions in letters. Some were eager to leave, desperate to reunite with loved ones. Others were strangely reluctant, having found a kind of stability in camp routine that they knew would be absent in ruined Germany. The last Sunday before the first group's departure was emotionally overwhelming. The chapel was packed beyond capacity, with prisoners standing along the walls and spilling out the doorway. Harris had prepared something special for this farewell service, and what he did that morning would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. After the opening hymns and prayers, Harris invited all the German prisoners who were preparing to leave to come forward and stand before the altar. Dozens of women made their way to the front, filling the space between the pews and the raised platform where Harris stood. They looked uncertain, vulnerable, wondering what was coming next. Harris spoke, his voice carrying through the hushed chapel. "You came here as enemies," he said slowly, clearly, giving the interpreter time to translate each phrase. "You came as prisoners of war, captured by a nation you had been taught to hate and fear. But today, you leave as witnesses. Not witnesses to America's power or military might, but witnesses to something more important. You are witnesses to the truth that even in war, compassion can survive. That even between enemies, faith can create connection. That God's love transcends the boundaries we create between nations and races and ideologies." He paused, and Anna saw tears forming in his eyes. "I do not know what you will find when you return home. I know it will be difficult. I know you will face hardship and grief. But I want you to carry something with you, a memory that cannot be taken away. Remember that in this place on American soil, you were treated not as enemies but as sisters. Remember that we sang together, prayed together, broke bread together. Remember that when everything else in your world was falling apart, you found that faith and compassion still existed, still mattered, still had the power to transform." He reached behind the altar and pulled out a stack of small books, German-language hymnals that had been used in the chapel throughout the prisoners' captivity. "I am giving each of you one of these hymnals to take home," he said. "Inside each one, I have written a message. Carry these home with you. When life is hard, when you are tempted to despair or bitterness, open these books and remember that another way is possible." One by one, the German women approached Harris and received their hymnals. When Anna's turn came, she took the worn book from his hands and opened the cover. Inside, in Harris's careful handwriting, was a brief inscription. "Faith without hatred is stronger than armies. Carry it home. With prayers for your journey, Captain William Harris, May 1945." She looked up at him, this American chaplain who had shown her mercy when she expected only punishment, who had invited her into worship when she anticipated mockery, who had treated her as fully human when she felt like nothing more than a defeated enemy. She wanted to say something, to express gratitude or explain what his ministry had meant, but words failed her. Instead, she simply nodded, clutching the hymnal to her chest, and returned to her pew. When all the prisoners had received their books, Harris offered a final benediction, a prayer for traveling mercies and for Germany's healing. The service ended, but no one moved immediately. People sat in the pews, reluctant to leave, knowing that this community that had formed in such unlikely circumstances was about to dissolve. Finally, slowly, prisoners and guards began to file out, some embracing despite regulations against fraternization, others simply shaking hands, acknowledging the human connection that had formed despite the war. Anna walked back to her barrack in a daze, the hymnal clutched in her hands like a precious artifact. That night, she wrote in her diary for what she thought might be the last time before going home. "Tomorrow, we begin the journey back. I don't know what I will find in Germany. I don't know if my mother is still alive, if our home still stands, if anything I remember still exists. I am terrified, but I am also carrying something precious. I know now that the enemy is not who they told us it was. I know that Americans are not monsters, but people, capable of great compassion. I know that black people are not inferior, but fully human, deserving of dignity and respect. I know that faith can transcend nationalism, and that God's love is larger than any government's propaganda. I don't know if anyone will believe me when I tell them what happened here. I don't know if I can explain in words what I experienced in that chapel. But I'm going to try. Germany needs people who have seen that another way is possible. Maybe that's why I survived when so many others died. Maybe that's my purpose now, to carry this witness home and help build something better from the ruins." The journey home was long and grueling, almost anticlimactic after the intensity of that final chapel service. Transport trucks carried the first group of repatriating prisoners to a port where ships waited to carry them back across the Atlantic. Anna stood on the deck as the American coastline disappeared behind them, watching until the land vanished completely into the ocean. She felt like she was leaving something essential behind, some version of herself that had been born in that chapel and might not survive the return to Germany. The Atlantic crossing in summer 1945 was entirely different from the autumn 1944 journey that had brought them to America. Then, they had been terrified prisoners, certain they were sailing toward death. Now they were repatriates heading toward an uncertain future, but no longer afraid of their former captors. The American crew treated them with professional courtesy, nothing more, but also nothing less. They were fed adequately, given access to the deck for fresh air, allowed to move about the ship with relative freedom. During the long days at sea, Anna and other prisoners talked endlessly about what they would find in Germany. Some clung to optimism, insisting their families would have managed to preserve something of their pre-war lives. Others were more realistic, having received letters describing near-total destruction. Anna fell somewhere in between, hoping for the best but bracing for the worst. She spent hours on deck, watching the ocean and thinking about how to explain what had happened to her. How could she tell her mother about singing Silent Night with American soldiers? How could she describe Captain Harris without sounding like she'd betrayed Germany by accepting enemy compassion? How could she convey the transformation she'd undergone without seeming to repudiate her own family and nation? The questions had no easy answers, so she simply held them, letting them turn over in her mind as the ship rolled eastward across the Atlantic. When the transport finally docked at Bremerhaven in late July 1945, the prisoners got their first look at defeated Germany, and the sight was devastating beyond anything letters could have prepared them for. The port that Anna remembered as busy and prosperous was now a landscape of ruins. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their windows gaping, their walls blackened by fire. Cranes lay toppled, infrastructure destroyed by bombing. And everywhere, crowds of displaced persons, refugees from the Eastern Territories, former concentration camp prisoners, ex-soldiers trying to get home, all milling about in a chaos that seemed to have no organizing principle. The German women disembarked and were processed by Allied occupation authorities, photographed again, given documentation, issued basic ration cards. The processing was efficient but impersonal, reflecting the victors' wariness of German civilians even as they tried to prevent starvation and disease. Anna received her papers and a small amount of occupation currency, then was pointed toward a refugee center where she might find transportation inland toward Bremen. The journey from Bremerhaven to Bremen, normally a few hours by train, took 3 days. The rail infrastructure was damaged, schedules were chaotic, trains were packed beyond capacity, with displaced persons all trying to reach somewhere that might still feel like home. Anna and several other women from her camp managed to squeeze onto a freight train that was heading roughly in the right direction. They sat on the floor of a boxcar with dozens of other refugees, sharing the space with people's meager possessions and a pervasive smell of unwashed bodies and despair. As the train crawled through the German countryside, Anna stared out through the open boxcar door and tried to process what she was seeing. This was not the Germany she remembered. Fields lay unplanted or half-tended, villages showed damage from fighting or bombing. Bridges were destroyed, replaced by temporary military spans. Former Wehrmacht soldiers, identifiable by their haircuts and bearing even in civilian clothes, trudged along roads going nowhere in particular. Children with hollow eyes watched the train pass, too listless even to wave. This was defeat, total and absolute, and it was more terrible than anything Anna had imagined during her captivity. When the train finally reached Bremen, or what remained of it, Anna climbed down from the boxcar and stood on the platform in shock. The Bremen of her childhood was gone. In its place stood an apocalyptic landscape of rubble and ruin. Perhaps 60% of the city had been destroyed by Allied bombing, with the historic center almost completely leveled. Buildings she had known her entire life, the churches and shops and homes that had formed the backdrop of her youth, no longer existed. Instead, there were acres of broken stone, twisted metal, and the sweet, sick smell of decay that still lingered from bodies buried in the rubble. Anna walked through streets she barely recognized, using the few landmarks that remained standing to navigate toward her family's neighborhood. The journey that should have taken 15 minutes on foot took over an hour, as she had to detour around impassable streets and collapsed buildings. Other survivors moved through the ruins like ghosts, their faces expressionless, focused only on the immediate tasks of survival. No one made eye contact. No one spoke unless necessary. The city felt dead, despite the people moving through it, a corpse that hadn't realized it should lie down. When she finally reached her family's street, or the rubble-strewn path where the street had been, Anna's heart sank. The apartment building where she'd grown up was a partial ruin. 3 of its 5 stories collapsed, the remaining 2 floors exposed to the elements like a dollhouse with its front wall removed. But there were signs of habitation, laundry hanging from makeshift lines, smoke rising from what must be a cooking fire inside. She picked her way through the rubble and called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Mutter? Heinrich? Is anyone here?" For a long moment there was no response, and Anna felt despair beginning to well up. Then a figure appeared in what had been a 3rd-floor window, now at ground level thanks to the collapsed floors below. Her mother, older and thinner than Anna remembered, but alive, unmistakably alive. "Anna, is that you? Oh God, Anna!" Her mother scrambled down from the ruined building, and they met in the street, embracing desperately, both crying. Anna's mother was emaciated, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost perhaps 40 pounds. But she was alive, and after a year of uncertainty, that was everything. They made their way back into the ruins of the apartment building, where Anna's mother and younger brother had created a living space in what had been the cellar, now open to the sky but offering some shelter from weather. Heinrich was there, a teenager now, taller than Anna remembered, but painfully thin, and with eyes that looked decades older than his years. The reunion was joyful and heartbreaking simultaneously. They were together again, but the context of their reunion was so bleak that joy felt almost inappropriate. That first night, huddled in the cellar around a small fire built from scavenged wood, Anna's mother recounted what had happened since Anna's capture. The RAF bombing raid that destroyed much of Bremen in 1944. The final chaotic months of the war, with food supplies collapsing and Nazi officials fleeing. The arrival of British occupation forces, the discovery of concentration camp survivors, and the horrifying stories they told. The struggle to find food, to avoid disease, to simply survive day by day in a city that had been bombed back to the Stone Age. Her mother spoke in a flat monotone, reciting horrors as if they were mundane facts, which in post-war Germany they were. When her mother finally asked about Anna's captivity, expecting stories of hardship and deprivation, Anna struggled to answer. How could she explain that she had been safe, that she had been fed, that she had slept on a mattress with clean sheets and attended chapel services where Americans treated her with respect? The contrast between her experience and her family's was so stark, it felt obscene. She started carefully, describing the camp, the work assignments, the basic conditions. Her mother nodded, relieved that Anna hadn't suffered too greatly. Then Anna mentioned the chapel, the Christmas service, the Easter hymns, and she saw her mother's expression change to something between confusion and concern. They had church services? For prisoners? Her mother asked. Yes, Anna said softly. The American chaplain, he invited us to worship. He said we were all children of God even though we were enemies. Her mother was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of bitterness Anna had never heard before. They sang hymns with you while they bombed our cities. They prayed with you while our children starved. How very Christian of them. The words stung because they contained truth. The same nation that had shown Anna compassion in captivity had prosecuted total war against Germany, reducing cities to rubble and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in the process. How could both things be true simultaneously? How could Americans be both merciful captors and ruthless bombers? Anna had no answer, but she knew that dismissing either reality would be a form of dishonesty. I know, she said quietly. It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. But Mutter, I have to tell you, what I saw in America, it wasn't what we were told. They weren't godless. They weren't weak or decadent, they were just people, and they treated us better than our own government ever did. Her mother's head snapped up, eyes sharp with something between anger and fear. Don't say such things. You don't know who might be listening. The British are arresting people for less. Anna looked around at the ruins surrounding them, at the complete collapse of everything the Nazi regime had built. Who am I going to get in trouble with? It's over, mutter, all of it. The Reich is gone, and maybe it needed to go because it was built on lies. The conversation ended there, her mother turning away and refusing to engage further. But Anna knew she'd planted a seed of doubt, a question that couldn't be easily dismissed. Over the following days and weeks, as Anna struggled to adapt to the harsh reality of life in occupied Germany, she began to share her story more widely. Not loudly or publicly, that would have been dangerous in a country where bitterness and resentment simmered just beneath the surface of exhausted compliance. But quietly, in conversations with neighbors who came to the cellar to barter or share news, Anna would mention pieces of what she'd experienced. She told them about the abundance of food, the clean beds, the voluntary chapel services. Some listeners reacted like her mother, viewing it as propaganda or as a cruel irony given Germany's suffering. But others listened with genuine curiosity, asking questions, trying to understand how the supposed enemy could behave so differently from what they'd been taught to expect. One woman, Frau Schmidt from a nearby ruined apartment, sat in the cellar one evening and listened to Anna describe the Christmas service, the singing of Silent Night in German and English. When Anna finished, Frau Schmidt was quiet for a long time, then said, "My husband died in the war. My son is missing, probably dead in Russia. I have nothing left but hatred for the people who did this to us. But what you're describing, Americans singing our songs, that's not the behavior of monsters. That's something else. I don't know what to do with that information." "Neither do I," Anna admitted. "But I think we have to hold on to it somehow. Because if we only remember the bombing, if we only focus on what they destroyed, then we'll stay trapped in hatred forever. And I don't think Germany can survive that way." Frau Schmidt nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. God knows hatred hasn't served us well so far." These conversations, multiplied across millions of German civilians, would form part of the psychological foundation for post-war reconciliation between Germany and the West. The personal testimonies of POWs who had been treated humanely, despite being enemies, helped counteract the narrative of permanent victimhood and resentment that could have poisoned German society for generations. Every story about an American guard sharing cigarettes or a chaplain offering comfort was a small brick in the rebuilding of trust between former enemies. By September 1945, Anna had found work at a makeshift clinic established by the British occupation authorities to address malnutrition and disease in the civilian population. Her medical training as an auxiliary nurse, combined with her ability to speak some English learned in school and improved through exposure in the camp, made her valuable. She worked long hours treating malnourished children, distributing medicine when available, trying to prevent the outbreak of epidemics that could ravage a population already weakened by starvation and exposure. Each Sunday, despite exhaustion, Anna made her way to the ruins of St. Petri Cathedral, where a small congregation gathered among the rubble for worship. The roof was gone, the walls were damaged, but the altar still stood, and a Lutheran pastor who had survived the war led services there. Anna brought her hymnal, the one Captain Harris had given her, and when they sang, she remembered that wooden chapel in America, the blending of languages, the moments when enemy had transformed into sister in faith. The pastor, Reverend Müller, noticed Anna's worn hymnal one Sunday and asked about it after the service. She told him the story, haltingly at first, but then with growing confidence, about the POW camp, about Captain Harris, about Christmas and Easter, and the black chaplain who had challenged every racist assumption she'd been raised with. Müller listened intently, his weathered face thoughtful. When Anna finished, he was silent for a moment, then said, "What you experienced was grace, pure and undeserved, and grace has a way of spreading like light in darkness. You need to share this story, Anna. Germany needs to hear stories like yours." "Who would listen?" Anna asked. People are too busy surviving to care about chapel services in America. Survival is necessary, Müller replied, but it's not sufficient. Germany needs to survive physically, yes, but also spiritually and morally. We need to understand how we fell so far, how an entire nation embraced evil while believing it was pursuing good. Your story offers a clue. It shows how direct experience can break through propaganda, how compassion can penetrate ideology. That's important. That matters. Encouraged by Müller, Anna began to speak more openly about her experiences. She wrote letters to newspapers, though few were published in the chaotic months after the war. She spoke to youth groups that were forming in the ruins, young Germans trying to make sense of their parents' catastrophic choices. She told her story to anyone who would listen, not as pro-American propaganda. She wasn't naive about America's own flaws and contradictions, but as testimony to the possibility of reconciliation, the power of treating enemies as human beings rather than categories. Not everyone wanted to hear it. Many Germans were trapped in cycles of self-pity and resentment, viewing themselves purely as victims of Allied aggression while refusing to acknowledge the crimes committed in their name. Anna encountered bitter resistance from those who insisted that Nazi propaganda had been basically accurate, that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated, that the stories about concentration camps were exaggerated. These encounters were frustrating and disheartening, but Anna persisted because she had seen truth with her own eyes and couldn't unsee it. By early 1946, life in Bremen had stabilized slightly. Food was still desperately scarce, the black market thrived, and the ruins remained largely uncleared. But a rudimentary infrastructure was emerging. Schools reopened. Employment offices began functioning. The British occupation authorities, despite some heavy-handed policies, were working to prevent starvation and restore basic services. Germany was beginning the long, slow crawl back toward normalcy, though normalcy would be very different from what had existed before. Anna found work at a more permanent clinic, one that was being established as part of the reconstruction effort. Her supervisor was a British Army doctor named Captain Morrison, who, upon learning of Anna's experience in American POW camps, asked her detailed questions about camp medical facilities and procedures. Morrison was writing reports for occupation authorities about best practices for managing displaced persons, and he found Anna's observations useful. The conversation with Morrison led to an unexpected opportunity. He mentioned that there were exchange programs being established, ways for Germans with particular skills or experiences to spend time in Britain or America, learning democratic governance and helping to build bridges between former enemies. Would Anna be interested in something like that? The question caught her off guard. Return to America? Leave her family again when they'd only just been reunited? It seemed impossible. But the idea planted itself in her mind and wouldn't leave. She discussed it with her mother, who was predictably negative. You would abandon us again to go back to the people who destroyed our country. But Heinrich, now 17 and with the idealism of youth not yet crushed, saw it differently. Maybe it's a way forward, Mutter. Someone has to build the bridge between our world and theirs, or we'll be stuck in this hatred forever. Anna ultimately decided not to pursue the exchange program, at least not immediately. Her family needed her, and her work at the clinic was important. But the conversation crystallized something for her, a sense of mission or calling that would guide the rest of her life. She would be a bridge, someone who had stood on both sides of the war and could testify to the humanity found in both places. Over the following years, as Germany began its economic recovery and political reconstruction, Anna continued to share her story. She spoke to church groups, to civic organizations, to schools. She corresponded with Captain Harris, who had returned to his parish in Iowa but maintained contact with several of the German prisoners he'd ministered to. His letters were warm and encouraging, offering spiritual guidance and practical advice as Anna navigated the complexities of post-war German life. In one particularly meaningful letter in 1947, Harris wrote, "I have heard from several of the women who were in our camp, and I am moved by how many of you are working toward reconciliation and reconstruction. This is exactly what I prayed for during those chapel services, that you would carry home not just memories, but transformed hearts. Germany's future depends on people like you who have seen that another way is possible." Anna kept that letter for the rest of her life, along with the hymnal he'd given her. By 1948, when the Berlin airlift demonstrated Western commitment to defending German freedom against Soviet pressure, the geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically. Former enemies were becoming allies in a new Cold War, and Germans who had experienced American compassion firsthand became valuable voices for this new alliance. Anna found herself invited to speak at events promoting German-American friendship, sharing her story as testimony to shared values and the possibility of reconciliation. Some accused her of being an American propagandist or of whitewashing Allied war crimes. She accepted these criticisms without defensiveness, acknowledging that her experience was not universal and that many Germans had legitimate grievances. But she insisted that her testimony was true, that what she'd experienced in that chapel was real, and that Germany's future lay in partnership with the West rather than in isolation or resentment. The Marshall Plan, beginning in 1948, brought American aid to rebuild Western Europe, including West Germany. Anna watched as American money and expertise began to transform her ruined country, building new factories, repairing infrastructure, reviving the economy. The same nation that had bombed German cities was now helping to rebuild them. And this paradox echoed her personal experience of American ruthlessness and compassion coexisting. The combination worked, however paradoxical. By the early 1950s, West Germany was experiencing an economic miracle, growing faster than almost any other European nation. Cities rose from the rubble, industry hummed back to life, refugees were integrated, and democracy took root in soil that had seemed permanently poisoned by totalitarianism. The decade following Anna's return to Germany saw transformations that would have seemed impossible amid the ruins of 1945. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949 from the Western occupation zones, became a functioning democracy with robust protections for human rights and civil liberties. The same German population that had enthusiastically supported Hitler embraced democratic governance with surprising rapidity, suggesting that the problem had never been some intrinsic German defect, but rather the power of propaganda and the human tendency to follow authority. Anna watched these changes with a mixture of hope and wariness, always conscious that transformation could be reversed if people forgot the lessons of the past. She married in 1950 a man named Klaus who had served on the Eastern Front and returned with his own trauma and his own complicated relationship with Germany's past. Together, they had 2 children, and Anna was determined that her children would grow up with a very different understanding of the world than she had received. She told them stories about the POW camp, about Captain Harris, about singing Silent Night with Americans. She taught them that national identity was important, but not ultimate, that faith transcended political boundaries, that former enemies could become friends if both sides chose compassion over resentment. Her children grew up bilingual. Anna insisted they learn English, and they absorbed her conviction that Germany's future lay in integration with the West rather than isolation. By the mid-1950s, Anna had become something of a local figure in Bremen, known for her work promoting German-American friendship and for her involvement in church-based reconciliation efforts. She joined organizations dedicated to building bridges between former enemies, speaking at schools and community centers about her experiences. The story of the POW chapel became her signature narrative, a parable about the power of compassion to break through hatred and ideology. She refined the telling over years of repetition, knowing which details resonated most powerfully, which moments captured the transformation she wanted her audiences to understand. In 1956, Captain William Harris visited Germany as part of a church delegation, exploring post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. Anna received a letter months in advance informing her of his visit, and she felt a surge of emotion she hadn't anticipated. This man who had shown her mercy when she expected only punishment, who had invited her into worship when she anticipated mockery, was coming back into her life after more than a decade. The reunion took place in the rebuilt sanctuary of St. Petri Cathedral, which had been painstakingly restored from the ruins Anna remembered. Harris was older now, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes held the same kindness she remembered from the chapel in America. They embraced awkwardly, aware of the curious stares from others in the church, then sat together in a pew and talked for hours. Harris wanted to know everything about Anna's life since repatriation, about her family, her work, her efforts to share the story of the chapel. Anna in turn asked about his ministry, about the other prisoners he'd stayed in contact with, about whether he understood the full impact of what he'd done during those years as a camp chaplain. "I think I'm only beginning to understand it now," Harris admitted. "At the time, I was just doing what seemed right, ministering to people in need regardless of their nationality. But hearing from you and others about how those experiences shaped your lives, about how you've worked for reconciliation and democracy in Germany, it's humbling. I think God used those chapel services in ways I never could have planned or anticipated." They attended a service together that Sunday, sitting side by side in the rebuilt cathedral as a German congregation sang hymns in a nation that was no longer at war, no longer under dictatorship, no longer enemy to the country Harris represented. During the service, they sang Stille Nacht together one more time, their voices blending in that same harmony from Christmas 1944, and Anna felt the circle closing, the story reaching a kind of resolution. Harris's visit generated significant attention in the German press. Here was an American chaplain who administered to German POWs during the war, returning to see how those prisoners had become citizens of a democratic Germany allied with the United States. Journalists interviewed both Harris and Anna, and their story appeared in newspapers across West Germany, a human interest piece that illustrated the broader narrative of reconciliation and alliance between former enemies. Some readers responded with gratitude and appreciation for this testimony to American compassion. Others wrote angry letters accusing Anna of betraying Germany's dead, of making excuses for the bombing campaigns that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, of collaborating with the enemy. Anna read these letters with sadness, but without surprise. She understood that not everyone was ready or willing to embrace reconciliation, that many Germans still nursed grievances that prevented them from moving forward. She responded when she could, patiently explaining that acknowledging American compassion didn't require denying American destructiveness, that both realities coexisted and needed to be held together honestly. Harris remained in Germany for 2 weeks, visiting multiple cities and speaking at churches and universities about his wartime ministry. Everywhere he went, he encountered former German POWs who had been in American camps, many of whom credited their camp experiences with opening their eyes to democratic values and the possibility of a different kind of society. The cumulative impact of these testimonies began to shape a narrative within West Germany about how captivity in American camps had functioned as a kind of unintentional but effective re-education program, not through heavy-handed indoctrination, but through the simple demonstration of values like religious freedom, human dignity, and compassion toward enemies. This narrative was useful for the emerging Cold War alliance, as it suggested that Germans and Americans shared fundamental values and that their partnership was natural rather than imposed. But it was also true, grounded in the lived experiences of hundreds of thousands of prisoners who had encountered American society firsthand and found it very different from Nazi propaganda's portrayal. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Anna's story took on new significance as West Germany confronted the question of how to deal with its Nazi past. The early post-war years had been characterized by what historians would later call a communicative silence, a reluctance to discuss the Hitler years too directly, a focus on rebuilding and moving forward rather than examining guilt and complicity. But by the late 1950s, a younger generation was beginning to ask harder questions. How had their parents supported Hitler? How had ordinary Germans participated in or ignored atrocities? What explained the enthusiastic embrace of an ideology that led to such catastrophic destruction? Anna's story offered one answer to these questions. She could testify from personal experience about how propaganda shaped perception, how indoctrination from childhood created worldviews that seemed self-evidently true until direct experience contradicted them, how breaking free from ideological conditioning required more than just information, but transformative experiences that forced recognition of shared humanity. When she spoke to student groups, she didn't excuse her generation's choices, but she did explain the psychological and social mechanisms that had made those choices feel inevitable at the time. She described the power of being surrounded by messages that all pointed in the same direction, of having authority figures from parents to teachers to government officials all reinforcing the same worldview, of the social pressure to conform and the danger of dissent. And then she described how that worldview shattered when she encountered Americans who sang her hymns, prayed her prayers, and treated her not as an inferior enemy, but as a sister in faith. The most powerful thing about that chapel, she told one group of university students in 1963, was that it forced me to see Americans as fully human. Once I saw that, once I recognized our shared humanity, all the propaganda about racial superiority and national destiny collapsed. You can't maintain hatred for people you recognize as fundamentally like yourself. That's the lesson we need to remember, because the capacity for propaganda and dehumanization didn't die with Hitler. It's a permanent human temptation, and we have to actively resist it in every generation. The 1960s also saw Anna reconnecting with other women who had been in the POW camp with her. Lotte, her closest friend during captivity, had settled in Hamburg and worked as a translator. Gerda, the ideological holdout who had eventually been moved by the Christmas service, had emigrated to Canada after the war and sent occasional letters describing her new life. Others had scattered across Germany and the world, but the shared experience of the chapel created a bond that persisted across decades and distances. In 1965, Anna helped organize a reunion of former prisoners from her camp, timed to coincide with the 20th anniversary of Germany's surrender. About 30 women managed to attend, gathering in Bremen to share memories and reflect on how their lives had unfolded since that pivotal time. The reunion was emotional, with tears and laughter intermingling as they remembered their fear, their transformation, their gradual acceptance that the enemy was not who they'd been taught. They toured the rebuilt city, marveling at how thoroughly Bremen had recovered from the devastation they remembered. They attended a service at St. Petri Cathedral together, sitting as a group and singing the same hymns they'd sung in that POW chapel 20 years earlier. And they talked late into the night about what their experiences meant, how the chapel had shaped their subsequent lives, what lessons they needed to pass to the next generation. One theme emerged clearly from these conversations. Almost all of them credited their time in the POW camp, particularly the chapel experiences, with preparing them to become citizens of democratic Germany. They had seen religious freedom in action, had experienced being treated with dignity despite being powerless prisoners, had witnessed Americans living out stated values rather than just proclaiming them. When Germany needed people who could understand and embrace democratic governance, who could accept former enemies as partners, who could reject the authoritarian reflexes of the Nazi era, these women were ready because they'd already encountered these ideas in concrete form. The reunion generated another wave of media attention, with newspapers running features about this remarkable group of women and their unusual wartime experience. Some historians and journalists began to take serious interest in the broader story of German POWs in America, recognizing that this was an understudied aspect of World War II history that had significant implications for understanding post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. Anna was interviewed multiple times, her story preserved in oral history archives that would become valuable resources for future scholars. By the 1970s, as the generation that had lived through the war aged and began contemplating mortality, Anna felt increasing urgency about preserving her story. She began writing a memoir not primarily about herself, but about the chapel, about Captain Harris, about the transformative power of that Christmas service. The writing was slow and difficult, as she had to relive painful memories and confront aspects of her past she preferred to forget. But she persisted, believing that future generations needed to understand how easily humans could be manipulated by propaganda, and how powerful simple acts of compassion could be in breaking through ideological conditioning. Her memoir, published in 1977 under the title Stille Nacht, Wie Feinde zu Schwestern wurden, Silent Night, How Enemies Became Sisters, received positive reviews in Germany and was translated into English within a year. American readers, many of whom had never considered what happened to German POWs during the war, were fascinated by this inside account of how the camp system had functioned and what effects it had on prisoners' worldviews. The book sold moderately well, not becoming a bestseller, but finding an audience among people interested in World War II history, religious studies and reconciliation studies. Captain Harris, now retired and in his 70s, wrote a foreword to the English edition in which he reflected on his wartime ministry and expressed gratitude that his efforts had borne such fruit. "I never imagined," he wrote, "that those simple chapel services would have such lasting impact." Anna's story and stories like it remind us that even in the darkest times, small acts of compassion matter. They matter eternally, rippling forward through time in ways we cannot predict or control. To everyone who reads this book, I offer this challenge. Treat your enemies as human beings. See them as God sees them. You never know what transformation that simple act might unleash. The publication of Anna's memoir coincided with a broader cultural shift in Germany toward confronting the Nazi past more directly and honestly. The 1970s saw increased focus on Holocaust education, on examining ordinary Germans' complicity in Nazi crimes, on rejecting the comfortable narratives of victimhood that had dominated earlier decades. Anna's story fit into this shift by illustrating how ideology had functioned, how ordinary Germans had been shaped by propaganda, and how breaking free from that conditioning was possible, but required direct encounters with reality that contradicted the propaganda. She spoke at schools with increasing frequency, often paired with Holocaust survivors in programs designed to give students multiple perspectives on the Nazi era and its aftermath. These were difficult partnerships at first, as Holocaust survivors understandably felt little sympathy for Germans who claimed they hadn't known about the concentration camps or had been deceived by propaganda. But over time, Anna and several survivors she worked with found common ground in their shared commitment to preventing future atrocities through education. They agreed that understanding how propaganda worked, how ordinary people could support evil while believing they were doing good, was essential for preventing repetition. "I don't ask for sympathy," Anna told one audience that included both survivors and German students. "What happened to me in the POW camp was nothing compared to what happened to people in concentration camps. I was kept safe and fed while millions were murdered. But I can offer this testimony about how ideology functions, how it captures minds and shapes behavior. If my story helps even one person recognize propaganda and resist it, then perhaps some good comes from my complicity, however passive it was." These presentations were emotionally exhausting, but Anna believed they were necessary. Germany in the 1970s and 1980s was still grappling with how to remember its past, how to teach the next generation, how to build a democratic political culture that would prevent any return to authoritarianism. Every voice that could contribute to that project mattered, and Anna's particular perspective, someone who had been inside the propaganda system and then experienced its dismantling, was valuable. By the 1980s, Anna was in her 60s, grandmother to 5 children who had grown up in a prosperous democratic Germany that would have seemed impossible to imagine amid the ruins of 1945. She took satisfaction in their lives, their education, their comfort and security, all made possible by the reconciliation and reconstruction her generation had built. She took them to St. Petri Cathedral and told them stories about the POW chapel, about singing Silent Night with Americans, about Captain Harris and the Black Chaplain and the White Lilies at Easter. She wanted them to understand that peace and prosperity were not natural or inevitable, that they had been purchased through intentional choices to embrace reconciliation over resentment, democracy over authoritarianism, compassion over hatred. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and East and West Germany moved toward reunification, Anna watched the celebrations with complex emotions. Joy at the prospect of a unified democratic Germany, yes, but also awareness of how much work would be required to integrate populations that had lived under very different systems for 4 decades. She gave interviews about the challenges of reconciliation, drawing on her own experience of being reintegrated into German society after time in American captivity. "Reconciliation is not quick or easy," she told one journalist. "It requires patience, genuine listening, and willingness to understand experiences different from your own. East Germans have lived through things that West Germans cannot fully understand, and vice versa. But if Americans and Germans could become allies after everything that happened in the war, then surely East and West Germans can find common ground. It will take time, but it's possible." The 1990s brought increasing recognition of the role POW camps had played in post-war reconciliation. Academic conferences examined the topic, documentaries featured former prisoners sharing their stories, monuments were erected at former campsites, acknowledging this unusual chapter of military history. Anna participated in many of these events, traveling to America for the first time since her repatriation to speak at a conference about POW experiences and their long-term effects. The trip to America in 1994, 50 years after her original journey as a prisoner, was surreal. She flew rather than sailing, arriving in hours rather than weeks. She stayed in hotels rather than behind barbed wire. She was welcomed as an honored guest rather than confined as an enemy. And she visited the site of the former POW camp, which had been decommissioned after the war and was now agricultural land. Nothing remained of the barracks, the mess hall, the guard towers. But the chapel had been preserved, maintained by a local historical society as a memorial to the unusual ministry that had taken place there. Anna stood in that wooden building, older and smaller than she remembered, but unmistakably the same space where her world had been transformed, and felt overwhelming emotion. The pews where she'd sat were gone, replaced by a small museum with photographs and artifacts from the camp's history. But the altar remained, and the spot where Captain Harris had stood conducting those bilingual hymns. She placed her hand on the wooden wall and remembered the fear, the confusion, the gradual opening to hope and transformation. A small ceremony was held at the chapel during her visit, with local clergy, historians, and a handful of other former prisoners who had traveled for the event. They sang Silent Night together, voices tremulous with age, but still able to carry the melody that had meant so much half a century earlier. The local Lutheran pastor, who maintained the chapel as a memorial site, spoke about the power of faith to transcend divisions, about how this small building represented something larger than itself, a testament to the possibility of reconciliation. Anna was invited to say a few words, and she spoke simply about what the chapel had meant to her. "I came here as an enemy," she said in English, slowly and carefully. "I expected to be treated like an enemy. Instead, I was invited to worship. I was invited to sing my songs, pray my prayers, be fully human. That invitation changed my life and helped me become a citizen of a democratic Germany. This chapel is more than just a building. It is a reminder that even in war, compassion is possible, and that compassion can change the world." Captain William Harris had passed away in 1989, but his children attended the ceremony and brought letters their father had saved from German prisoners over the years. Reading these letters, seeing the impact one person's ministry had on dozens of lives, seeing how those transformed lives had rippled outward to shape families and communities, Anna understood that Harris's work had been more significant than even he had realized. One person choosing compassion over cruelty, choosing to see enemies as human beings, had contributed to the reconciliation of nations. The chapel ceremony received local media coverage, and the story spread, reminding Americans of this unusual aspect of their World War II history. Many Americans were surprised to learn that German POWs had been held on American soil, that they'd been treated relatively humanely, that many had returned to Germany with positive views of American values. The story challenged simplistic narratives about the war being purely a battle between good and evil, revealing the complexity of how former enemies became allies. Anna returned to Germany, energized by the trip and the recognition, determined to continue sharing her story as long as she was able. She understood that her generation, the last people with direct memories of World War II, was aging and would soon be gone. Once they died, the war would shift from living memory to history, preserved only in documents and recordings, and the memories of those too young at the time to fully understand what they'd experienced. The responsibility to testify, to pass the story to the next generation, while it still had the immediacy of lived experience, felt urgent. Through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Anna continued speaking at schools, churches, and civic organizations. She refined her message over thousands of repetitions, knowing exactly which details resonated most powerfully with different audiences. For religious groups, she emphasized the chapel services and the theology of treating enemies as siblings in faith. For schools, she focused on propaganda and how to resist ideological manipulation. For civic groups interested in reconciliation, she highlighted the practical policies that had enabled German-American friendship to emerge from the ruins of total war. In 2004, Anna turned 80 years old, and her family organized a celebration at St. Petri Cathedral with former POWs, local officials, religious leaders, and journalists in attendance. The event served as both a birthday party and a commemoration of the 60th anniversary of her capture and transportation to America. Anna gave a brief speech, reflecting on the arc of her life, how a terrified 20-year-old nurse expecting death in an enemy POW camp had instead encountered compassion that transformed her understanding of everything. "I am not special," she said to the assembled crowd. "I am just one person who was shown mercy when I expected only judgment, who was invited to worship when I expected only mockery, who was treated as human when I expected to be dehumanized." That experience shaped everything that came after. It enabled me to return to Germany not full of hatred and resentment, but open to reconciliation and rebuilding. It prepared me to be a citizen of a democratic nation, allied with former enemies. And it taught me the most important lesson of my life, that faith must be larger than nationalism, that God's love transcends the categories we create, and that seeing our enemies as fully human is the first step toward peace. The speech was her last major public address, though she didn't know it at the time. Her health began declining in 2005, and by 2006, she was largely confined to her home, receiving visitors but no longer able to travel or speak publicly. Her children and grandchildren cared for her, and she spent her final years surrounded by family, reviewing the memoir she'd written decades earlier, corresponding with historians researching POW experiences, and reflecting on the strange trajectory her life had taken. She maintained her daily prayer practice using the hymnal Captain Harris had given her 60 years earlier, its pages yellowed and fragile but still legible. Every night before sleep, she would open to Stille Nacht and read through the German lyrics, remembering that Christmas Eve, when German and American voices had blended in perfect harmony, when for one moment the war had ceased to matter and only faith remained. Anna Müller died peacefully in her sleep on December 23, 2007. One day before the 63rd anniversary of that transformative Christmas service, her family, honoring her wishes, held a funeral service at St. Petri Cathedral. The church was packed with people whose lives she had touched over 6 decades of testimony and witness. The service included Stille Nacht, sung in both German and English, a final echo of the chapel that had meant so much to her. Her worn hymnal, the one Captain Harris had inscribed with the words, "Faith without hatred is stronger than armies," was placed on her coffin as a symbol of everything she had represented. Obituaries in German newspapers recounted her story, calling her a bridge between former enemies, a witness to reconciliation, a woman whose personal transformation had contributed to national transformation. International media picked up the story, and for a few days, Anna's life reminded the world of the human dimensions of historical processes that often get reduced to abstract statistics and geopolitical strategies. The chapel in America held a memorial service as well, bringing together former prisoners, families of camp personnel, historians, and religious leaders to honor Anna's memory and reflect on what her story revealed about reconciliation. The pastor who maintained the chapel spoke about how Anna's life illustrated the power of small acts of compassion multiplied across time, how Captain Harris could never have imagined that his simple ministry would help transform a prisoner into a voice for reconciliation that would echo across decades. In the years since Anna's death, her story has continued to resonate. Her memoir has been reprinted multiple times, assigned in courses on World War II history, cited in academic studies of reconciliation processes. The chapel where she worshipped as a prisoner has become a destination for people interested in this unusual chapter of military history, preserved as a reminder that even in war, humanity can survive and even flourish under the right conditions. Historians studying post-war reconstruction have increasingly recognized the role that POW experiences played in preparing Germans to embrace democracy and alliance with the West. While it's impossible to quantify precisely how much former prisoners contributed to political and cultural transformation, the qualitative evidence from testimonies like Anna's suggests the impact was significant. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and auxiliaries experienced American society firsthand as prisoners, encountered democratic values in practice, and returned home with fundamentally altered worldviews. This cohort became part of the foundation on which democratic West Germany was built, providing a base of citizens who understood that alternatives to authoritarianism existed and could function effectively. The story of the POW chapel also resonates in contemporary discussions about how to counter extremism and radicalization. Anna's testimony about how direct experience broke through propaganda has been cited in studies of de-radicalization programs, illustrating that ideology is best countered not through better arguments, but through experiences that force recognition of shared humanity. When people who have been taught to hate actually encounter those they've been told are enemies, and when that encounter reveals common values and mutual respect, worldviews can shift in ways that pure information transfer never achieves. Religious communities have also found inspiration in the chapel story, seeing it as a powerful example of faith transcending political divisions. In an era when religion is often weaponized for nationalist or sectarian purposes, the image of enemies singing the same hymns together, praying the same prayers, acknowledging common ground in faith despite being on opposite sides of a war, offers a counter-narrative about what religious identity can mean. Captain Harris's insistence that in God's house there are no enemies, only children, challenges the easy equation of religious identity with national or tribal identity. Educational programs about World War II have increasingly incorporated stories like Anna's to give students a more nuanced understanding of the war beyond simple narratives of good versus evil. While the Allied cause was certainly just and Nazi Germany's crimes were monstrous, the human reality was always more complex. Understanding how ordinary Germans became complicit in evil, how they broke free from ideological conditioning, and how former enemies reconciled, provides crucial lessons for preventing future atrocities. Anna's story serves this educational purpose well because it neither excuses German crimes nor demonizes individual Germans, instead showing the mechanisms by which propaganda shapes perception and how those mechanisms can be disrupted. The chapel itself, that simple wooden building in rural America, has become a symbol of something larger than its physical structure. It represents the possibility that compassion can survive even in contexts designed to eliminate it, that seeing enemies as human beings is not weakness but profound strength, that small acts of kindness ripple forward in time, affecting lives and nations in ways we cannot predict or control. Every year on Christmas Eve, a small service is held there for anyone who wants to attend, with Silent Night sung in multiple languages, commemorating that moment in 1944 when German and American voices blended in harmony. The service attracts a mix of people: historians, religious pilgrims, descendants of prisoners and guards, locals curious about this piece of regional history, educators looking for inspiration, and occasionally former prisoners themselves or their children, coming to pay tribute to an experience that shaped their families' trajectories. The chapel's preservation represents a collective decision that this story matters, that it contains lessons we need to remember, that the possibility of reconciliation it represents must not be forgotten even as the generation that lived through the war passes away. For contemporary audiences grappling with conflicts that seem intractable, whether between nations, ethnic groups, or political factions, Anna's story offers both hope and realism. Hope because it demonstrates that even the deepest enmities can be overcome, that people shaped by hateful ideologies can transform, that compassion is powerful even in contexts dominated by violence. Realism because it shows how difficult that transformation is, how much it requires both structural changes and personal encounters, how easily it can fail without the right conditions. Reconciliation is possible, but never automatic, never simple, and never complete. It requires intentional effort, sustained over generations. The chapel ministry worked because Captain Harris and others like him made specific choices to treat enemies as human beings, because the broader American POW system provided decent conditions that allowed those human connections to form, and because Germany's total defeat created space for prisoners to question the ideology that had brought them to war. Remove any of those elements, and the outcome might have been very different, with POWs returning home full of resentment rather than openness to reconciliation. In the end, Anna's story is about the power of seeing and being seen as fully human. She arrived in America shaped by propaganda that taught her Americans were godless barbarians, racially inferior, spiritually empty. She returned to Germany having experienced Americans singing her songs, praying her prayers, treating her with dignity and respect, demonstrating through their actions that everything she'd been taught was false. That transformation occurred not through logical arguments or information campaigns, but through direct experience, through shared hymns in a wooden chapel, through meals eaten together, through the simple witness of compassion in action. The lesson, if there is one, is that ideology is most effectively countered not by better ideology, but by human connection that makes ideology irrelevant. When Anna lay dying in 2007, surrounded by family in a peaceful Bremen far removed from the ruins of 1945, she reportedly said something that captured the essence of her story. "I was captured expecting death and found life. I was imprisoned expecting cruelty and found kindness. I met enemies and discovered sisters. Everything I thought I knew was wrong, and learning that saved me." These words, preserved by her daughter and repeated at her funeral, serve as her epitaph and her legacy. They remind us that our certainties are often illusions, that those we've been taught to hate are often more like us than different, and that opening ourselves to see our enemy's humanity is not betrayal, but liberation. As long as people study World War II, as long as nations grapple with how to move beyond conflict, as long as religious communities wrestle with what faith means in a divided world, Anna's story will matter, a testament to a Christmas service in a POW camp, where enemies became sisters by singing Silent Night together in two languages that somehow formed one perfect harmony.